Sometimes a product or a service comes out before its time. Sometimes it takes a while for a product to find its niche and prove its value. The plastic worm was like that. An Akron, Ohio man named Nick Cream created the first soft plastic worm in 1949. He called it the wiggle worm, and it's still in production, made by the same company, Cream Lures, 75 years later. Although today they call it the scoundrel, and instead of making it in Akron, Ohio, they make it in Tyler, Texas. And of course, there's a reason for that. When Nick put his plastic worm in production in 1949, it looked quite different than what we think of as a plastic worm today. Shape and size were pretty ordinary, but it came with a heavy monofilament harness. Two little hooks were pre-rigged in the bait, and there was a propeller blade and red beads at the head. Cream sold some worms, but they hardly distracted anybody from the hard baits of the day or even from the pork rind lures that were very popular. It wasn't until more than a decade later that sales finally started to take off for the plastic worm. And ground zero for that surge was in Texas, just east of Dallas, around Lake Tawakoni. Tawakoni was a new reservoir back then, impounded in 1960. It was full of bass and brush. I bet you can see where I'm going. Cream's wiggle worm was just the right tool to navigate the brush in Lake Tawakoni, but not the way Nick sold it. It took some clever bass anglers in the area a little while to figure out a better way to do things, to reinvent Cream's plastic worm. They got rid of the propeller and the little red beads and the pre-rigged hooks. They took egg sinkers and cut them in half, and they used Sproat-style hooks, running them through the head of the worm, then back out, turning them around, and they made the lure self-weedless and brushless. Of course, it caught bass, and it mostly stayed out of trouble. People started calling it the weedless rig or the brushless rig, but eventually the name Texas rig caught on, and the word spread. The Texas rig worked everywhere. It still does. I tried for a long time to figure out who specifically invented the Texas rig, but I don't think there's an answer for that. I think it was a conglomeration of efforts from a lot of different anglers in that area. Everybody experimenting, everybody exchanging ideas, everybody showing each other what they had come up with to build a better mousetrap, or in this case, a better plastic worm. So much of Cream Lure Company's sales back then in the early 60s were coming from East Texas that Nick Cream moved his home and his manufacturing operation to Tyler, Texas, where it remains to this day. Before he passed away, Nick Cream sold the company to one of his employees, Wayne Kent. Wayne, too, passed away a few years ago, and today Cream Lures is owned and operated by Wayne's son and daughter-in-law. Nick Cream died 30 years ago this month. He lived to see his invention born and had the vision and determination to see it through until it became the greatest lure type in bass fishing history. Some things come before their time, but time passes, and sometime catches up with a product or idea. Welcome to Bass After Dark. I'm Ken Duke, and we're here tonight to earn your support, your subscription, your like, your share, and hopefully even your trust by showing you that inch for inch and pound for pound, we are the most illuminating show in bass fishing. Without further ado, it's time to bring in my co-host. You may not know this, but the original plans for the Ark called for 4 of every species, but they screwed up and hired the wrong carpenter for the job. Here's the man who actually submitted what should have been the winning bid. Please welcome Brian the Carpenter.
Jacob, that's where you hit the applause.
Yeah, we got to applaud BTC. I screwed up the year that Cream died. I just realized, Brian, he died 40 years ago, not 30 years ago, but oh well.
Oh man, I bet you he could have used that extra 10 years.
I guarantee it.
We all could.
Absolutely.
So we're on substitute producer tonight. Our man Nathan is out. We got Jacob filling in at the wheels of steel back there.
Indeed. More than up to the task. More than up to the task. Inch for inch and pound for pound, one of the finest engineers in our business.
Yeah, except for applauses.
Yeah.
Nope, still no applause. Anyhow, there it is.
We'll take it. We'll take it late. We'll take it early. Whatever.
I knew we could do it, Ken. So tonight's show.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm excited for it.
Right up your alley. You love the science.
Yeah,
I do too.
What should we know about crawfish, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or crayfish or crawdads or Maybe that should be one of our first questions.
Yeah. How many names do they call it? Different names in the South.
Yeah, mud bug. There's
All
one.
right. What do the what do the Cajuns call it?
I think they call them mud bugs.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Ken, here we are. And as always, after we get through the meat of the show, we have a few things tonight. I believe we're doing bad news tonight.
And indeed we are, sir. I think the outline reflects bad comments, and that's my mistake again, but hopefully the last one in the outline. Yeah, we got bad news tonight with intrepid reporter Justin Kingsley.
That's right. Intrepid. He's Googling that right now. Most of us are. So yes, we have bad comments. We have tonight's top 10 signs you might be a woman angler.
I think I drew the short straw, and I have to read that one and probably be canceled. That's okay.
It's going to be a fun one. And then we close the show with dark thoughts.
Indeed, sir. Indeed.
That's right. And tonight we are doing a giveaway from Lures and Lead, and it will be based off of a Ken Duke trivia question later in the show.
Yep. After our top 10, we're going to do a trivia question, and the winner is going to win a cool prize we'll tell you about momentarily.
That's right.
First, can I talk Livingston Lures for a moment?
How about it?
Hey, Bass After Dark is brought to you by Livingston Lures. Their electronic bait fish sound technology triggers the natural instinctive feeding cues of fish. You know, unlike most baits, which rely on beads or rattles to make a noise that have to be in motion to attract fish, Livingston adds the natural sounds of feeding or bait fish distress calls that bass recognize and use to find their food. They leverage the full range of sensory cues to attract fish, and they call the fish even when the lure is not in motion. Not a lot of baits do that. It's a technology difference that's going to make a difference in your catch rate. You can find Livingston Lures at all serious retail tackle outlets and at livingstonlures.com.
Yes. And we are also brought to you by Lures and Lead. Lures and Lead is an online fishing tackle platform focused on hard-to-find tackle, custom lures, and exclusive colors. They're also a great source for revealing well-kept bass catching secrets. Lures and Lead strives to be a must-follow for the tackle geek, but also an educator for all anglers. Check them out, luresandlead.com. Follow them on Facebook and Instagram. And this week, in honor of tonight's show topic, Lures and Lead is giving away a selection of great crayfish imitators, including 3 Spro RK Crawler, Rock Crawler, 55 crankbaits, popular crawl patterns, and a couple of packs of Berkeley Power Bait pit balls. I do love me some pit balls.
There you go.
So that's right. So tonight, be the first to answer the Ken Duke trivia question of the evening.
Coming up before too long, after top 10. And also the Bass Tank is your premier boat electronics destination. From beginners to pros, they have all the latest and the greatest. They can educate you, sell it to you, rig it for you, or teach you how to do it all yourself. Check them out at thebasstank.com and follow them on social media for the latest deals and discounts. This week's specials include a Garmin LV S32 refurbished transducer. It's been reduced $1,000 from just last week, BTC. It's now just $999.99 while their very limited supplies last. There's also a 9-inch chart plotter and refurbished LVS 32 transducer for $2,000, a 10-inch chart plotter and refurbished transducer for $2,300, and a 12-inch chart plotter and refurbished LVS 32 transducer for $3,000.
Fantastic. Guys, go ahead and get them before they go on. And tonight, what should we know about crayfish?
Yep. Let's get this thing rolling.
All right. Without further ado, our first guest is a 30-time Bassmaster Classic qualifier, 8-time BASS winner, a 2-time Bassmaster Angler of the Year, a co-founder of Major League Fishing, and a legendary pioneer of the flipping technique. Please welcome Gary Klein.
Woo! Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that intro, Brian. Ken, thanks for having me. I'm really, really excited about this evening because I feel like I'm going to be a student and I probably have more questions than I do answers.
Well, I tell you what, that's exactly, well, there's a lot of reasons I wanted to have you on the show, Gary. We've been looking for a great show to have you on, and we think this is it because I know you're such a student of the game. You know, most people who have attained the amazing heights, you have 30 classic appearances, a couple of AOIs at the highest level. My gosh, you have nothing left to prove anybody, but I know you're always trying to learn, and I admire that tremendously.
Well, thank you. I sure appreciate that. And, you know, yeah, I've had a great career, and I'm just one of those crazy fishermen that just has a passion for fishing. In fact, I was fishing yesterday. So that's what we do on our spare time. But hey, talking about the subject tonight, what's really cool though, for so many years, I've had the opportunity to actually make a living above the surface. And now I get to actually ask questions about something that is very important that takes place below the surface. Something that, I think I know a little bit about, but I think I'm really about to learn how much or how little I really know.
I expect we're going to be very impressed with what you know even now, but hopefully we can add to that a bit tonight. And I think we've got just the people to do it with. And BGC, we got more guests.
That's right. Our next guest is an 11-time Bassmaster Classic qualifier, 8-time BASS winner, and a 4-time Elite Series champion. Please welcome, for the second time, Mike McClelland.
How's it going, guys? Good to be here tonight.
Mike, I said to you when we were backstage, I said, Mike's the only of our guests tonight who's been on before, and I was shocked you were willing to come back. You just started laughing at me.
Well, I'll have to say, Ken, I mean, the show is such an interesting show from many perspectives, but the first time I was a guest, being on the show with the other phenomenal stickbait fishermen I was on the show with, and I can't remember exactly who I was on the show that night, but I mean, it was, as Gary said earlier, it was somewhat of a learning experience for me when I look at my stickbait knowledge and the way that I always did things versus the way the newer, younger generation is doing things now with live scope and forward-facing sonar, that it was an eye-opening experience. And when I heard this show was on crawfish, you know as well as I do that I've made a lot of money fishing crawfish imitating baits, and that was appealing to me. I want to learn more about crawfish because I like Gary. I feel like I know something about crawfish, but there's so many questions that I've got about crawfish that I'm anxious to follow through on this subject tonight.
And we have got the foremost crawfish, crayfish, crawdad, mudbug expert on the planet. BTC, could you introduce our next guest?
Rounding out our expert panel is a professor of biology and the chair of the Department of Orgasmic Biology, Ecology, and Zoo Science at West Liberty University in West Virginia. Please welcome Dr. Zachary Loughman.
Hi, y'all.
Doctor, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you all for having me.
This is
excited.
Every once in a while, we get to pull together one of these shows where we're talking about a technique or an aspect of the fishing world, and we really do make a serious effort to bring in the best panel imaginable. Ultimately, so any other show would look at what we're doing and say, "Well, there's no way in hell we can top this." And we thank you so much because you are that guy in the world of biology and education in this country, and you shared with us that a number of people even call you, what was it, Dr. Crawdad?
Yeah, Dr. Crawdad. That's what I am on social media. So there you go.
Now I'm going to blow away Mike and Gary by telling them and the rest of our audience that you actually have one or more species of crawdad named for you because you basically discovered them.
Yeah, I've described 15 species of crayfish. And by the way, just to get this out of the way, you can call them whatever the hell you want. So you can call them crawfish, crawdads, mudbugs, craw crabs. I don't care. And I will say there are places where it does matter what you call them, but because the local populace gets real upset if you use the wrong term. If you call a crawfish a crayfish in Louisiana or Eastern Texas, you might as well start running before you. That's just not okay. But anyway, yeah, my lab's described 15 species. We've done crayfish surveys literally all over the Southeast, and now we're kind of encroaching into the Midwest. So y'all have any questions about their biology, what little crayfish do, big crayfish do, how we get more crayfish, which crayfish are bad. There are actually some that can be really bad for a fishery. We can talk about that.
Wow.
But yeah, no, you ask away and I will do my best to answer.
Oh, we got questions. Don't you worry about that.
Before we go further, I want to send a shout out to Andrew Hayes from Tackle Talk Podcast. He's the one who put me on to you, Doctor. Crawfish.
That was a fun one.
Yeah, Andrew and Tackle Talk, terrific show, and we really admire Andrew. He's been a great friend. He's been on our show a couple of times. Doctor, you say that there's no right or wrong thing to call these critters. When you're talking with your students, when you're talking with other people who study these animals, is there a crawfish, crayfish, crawdad preference?
Yeah. So in my nerdy world of science, we actually call them by their Latin names. And what's really funny is people will come up to me and they'll be like, the Louisiana blue spotted crayfish lives here, right? And I'm like, I don't know what the hell that is, but it could be like Procambarus something, but there's been a push among the 9 people, by the way, that study crayfish, because there aren't that many of us, to kind of standardize the common names so that we can kind of address some aspects of their biology. So as a general rule, the official common names that are in our publications are normally end in either crayfish, crawfish, or if it's a species that you find up on the bank making the mud chimneys, or digging in a ditch, we call those mud bugs now. So when I describe a species, then I got to give it a common name and a Latin name. So I try to follow those rules to make it so that it makes sense to people.
So there is actually a difference in the crawfish that inhabit the water and the ones that you see in ditches and that build the little mud bogs, right?
Yes, ish is the way I would say that. Because there's definitely species that will be in the ditch, like next to the road, and then on the other side of the road you got your lake, and they're in the lake too. But then there's going to be species that are going to only live in that ditch. Here in Appalachia, where I'm in West Virginia, we have a bunch of those burrowing crayfish that actually live up on the mountainside, and they can be, a good solid mile away from any permanent water source that we would think was permanent. They're digging down to the water table, and that's their water source is the groundwater. So, but when you get into the southeast, it gets the deep southeast, gets a little bit wonky down there because of the nature of the animals, because you've got a lot of what we call ephemeral pools. Spring, there's water everywhere. Fall, a hurricane comes through, there's water everywhere. But in the middle of August, the water might dry up a little bit. So the crayfish burrow, and their propensity to burrow is in response to what habitat they live in and the amount of water that's normally there.
Hey, Doctor, for what it's worth, Gary is from California, but has lived most of his life now in Texas. Mike is from Arkansas. So we've got some good geographic spread here as well.
Yeah, Arkansas if you're a crayfish nerd, you like Arkansas.
And why is that?
Well, why is that? Ozark Mountains in the northern part. There's a unique group of crawfishes that live up there. And then along the Mississippi River, you got all those coastal plain or Gulf coastal plain swamps and little bayous and things like that. And that's just a different habitat that has a whole different suite of crayfish living in it. So, one thing I will say right off the bat, and I'll just keep saying this, especially for the anglers. One of the things I get a lot of is like, you study crayfish, and I say yes, and then there's more than one, and I'm like, yes. In North America, we have over 470 species of crayfish.
Wow.
So, and some of those crayfishes are all of them will be eaten by a bass, but some of them have a higher likelihood of being eaten by a bass. So if you're imitating those species that are a primary, forage for bass, you're probably going to do a lot better than if you just go grab any old crawdad. Like if you pull one out of those ditches, it's not going to have the same action as one of the species that's living in the weeds along the edge of the lake. So,
all right, Mike McClelland, 470 different species. You got some work to do on new colors for Spro.
No doubt. Where can I find all of these species, listed somewhere? Is there actually a book or a magazine that actually has them all? And
books are few and far between, but there are a few. There's one that just came out called Crayfishes of Alabama. That's a really good one because the authors of that book went to great lengths to get color photographs in life of all the species. And Alabama is like the Peruvian Amazon for crayfish people. That there's more crayfish that live in Alabama than anywhere else on the planet.
Wow.
So, yeah, I actually think they just crossed the threshold. If they didn't, they're right at it of 100 different species just in that state.
Wow.
So,
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, just a couple of questions that I've got. First of all, I'm amazed at 470 species. I knew there was quite a few, but not that many.
yeah.
But isn't it fair to say, though, that a crayfish is kind of like a bass? They're conditioned by the environment that they live in. And I don't know how well crayfish can adapt from one environment to the other, but I know I can take a bass from, the East Coast and put it over in the West Coast and it's going to survive. Or I can take a fish out of clear water and put it in dirty water and it's going to survive. I mean, that's just the nature of the fish. Are crawdads like that also?
Yes. Some are not. It depends on the broad habitat they evolved to live in. So we're going to use big words, but these are easy. There's this genus Procambrus. That's the one you're going to find in your weed-choked marshes and where you got a bunch of aquatic plants, lily pads, the coontail, all that kind of stuff up in the shallows. The Procambrus species, and unfortunately there isn't a common name for them that I know of. The species that you eat in Louisiana, the red swamp crayfish, is in this genus. Those animals are extremely adaptive. Really, the only thing that's going to kill them, and this is even questionable now, is cold temperature, like extremely cold temperature. But the reason why they're so adaptive and they do well, an adaptive crayfish, when the oxygen level drops in the water, crayfishes actually go to the surface and they lay on their side and they breathe atmospheric oxygen through their gills. Their gills just need to be a little bit wet. So that's why I see it on YouTube. People send me videos of like, what the hell's going on here? If a lake or a water body goes anoxic and it gets real hot and the oxygen level drops, what the crawfish do is they just say peace and they're out. And they leave the lake in mass and start walking across the field, roads, whatever the hell's there. And it's kind of a last ditch effort to get to another body of water. So if you can do that and you're an aquatic thing, you can pretty much live anywhere. But where I live and in the Ozarks of Missouri and Arkansas, where you've got spring-fed streams and really specific water quality parameters and high oxygen and cold water, those species of crayfish don't really do well when you try to move them from point A to point B, because they've adapted for essentially what would be kind of like a trout stream, if you will. And so if you take that animal and you move it down to Florida, it's going to be too hot. The oxygen level is going to be too low. It doesn't have flowing water, so they're not going to do well. But most of the species that are primary bait species, they're very adaptable, and they can get into trouble because if you can move them across watersheds, which I, as a crayfish conservation guide, don't think you should do. And if you can get them established as an invasive, and a lot of people are like, a crayfish is a crayfish is a crayfish, and that's just simply not true. These species, when you move them around, they can take over, and they can be, while they're forage for a bass, they can be bad for bass, because what they'll do is they'll get into the bedding grounds where you need the aquatic plants, and they'll eat the plants, and they'll literally eliminate all of the plants. And then you lose your spawning grounds for your bass fishery, and then your bass fishery starts to tank. And that's been documented time and time again. When you kind of get out of the southeast, where these where red swamp crayfish and things like that aren't native to, those systems haven't adapted to that. But other places, it's a different story.
So speaking of invasive crawfish,
yes,
when I was at Leech Lake in Minnesota this year competing in Bassmaster EQ qualifier, I believe it was one of my co-anglers that was from that area said that there was an invasive species of crawfish in Leech Lake. And I'm like, how can crawfish be invasive to a body of water. I'm like, what makes them invasive? You know, do the bass still eat them, right? And he said that bass will probably still eat them some, but he said that they're like really hard for bass to digest. What do you? I mean, what's the deal with those?
Yep. All right. I won't go negative, but we're going to talk about this because it's been asked. The most important thing y'all can do as bass fishermen is pay attention to the species crayfish where you're at. So that guy nailed it. There's a crayfish up in the north called the rusty crayfish.
Rusty crawl.
It's native. It's native to like east, right, Columbus, Ohio, the Scioto River that goes down to the Ohio. That's an area where rusties are native to. You can identify these guys really easily. You pick one up. They're actually really cool looking crawdads. They're purple and blue and kind of green. They got this big rusty spot on the back part of their shell. And that species of crayfish, nobody knows why this is the one, but when you move it from its native stream into a non-native system where it wasn't adapted for, it produces a ton of babies. One female can make anywhere from 200 to 400 babies. And then those babies eat plants like it's their job, and they grow wicked fast. And they can go from being half a centimeter long to an inch and a quarter, inch and a half long in about 3 months. And the only way you do that is if you're just eating and mowing down everything you come in contact with. Well, what ends up happening is they take out the crayfish that the bass have adapted to eat, and they completely overwhelm them. Like basically, I'm talking thousands of crayfish. There's a river in Pennsylvania called the Susquehanna River, which you all know. It's got smallmouth in it. Rusticus was introduced to that system, and they completely wiped out the native species. And then they just started destroying everything that lives on the bottom of the river. And fisheries have now started tanking in response to there's just too many crawdads. So what happens is the rusties overwhelm the system, and it's like too much of a good thing as far as bass are concerned. And so when they go to feed, the one that they've adapted to eat and can digest isn't there. The one that they haven't adapted to eat is now, there's not one of them per square foot. There's 10 of them per square foot. And what ends up happening is they basically grow so fast that they can get to the point where they're so large that the juvenile bass and the young of the year bass can't eat them. And so because of that, you end up having the young bass part of the population starts to die off because they don't have the little crayfish they normally would be eating. Now we've got these big, gnarly crawdads that fight back. That's the other thing about rusties. They're nasty. If you go to like pick them up out of a bait bucket, they pinch the hell out of you. Whereas, so, you know, when a bass goes to eat a crayfish normally will just basically face off with them, put their claws up like this, and then backpedal out. A rusticus just stands there and takes on the bass. And it'll actually pinch the bass in the mouth, pinch the bass on the face, pinch the bass in the eye, and the bass will, like, you know, release it, try to eat it. They just don't want to be eaten. And so what ends up happening is the nutritional ability of that crayfish is so low that the bass can't eat it. They go looking out for the other crayfish. Rusties have gotten rid of it, and your bass population starts to sink. So, and this isn't like nonsense science. This has been studied now for 20, 30 years. Like, I've seen it with my own eyes. I've sampled in streams where rusties weren't present, and fish were everywhere. The rusticus show up. They hire someone like me to go in and document what's going on. And usually you end up seeing a decline in certain species of fish, and those would be the fish that feed on the crayfish. It's very interesting dynamic.
You're mentioning this about the rusties, and I was going to ask you that question. I'm glad Mike did. In Minnesota, there's a lake called Mille Lacs, and it's one of the better smallmouth fisheries. I spend a lot of time with an Ocview camera, just drifting around, recording and all that. And what was amazing is I was on a real good wind drift just going, and I was in 25, 30 foot of water in the middle of the lake. And of course, it's covered with zebra mussels. And the entire bottom and out there in that deep water, there's like a big, I guess it's a rusty crawl about every 10 feet. And they were solid white on the belly and a real bright orange shell. And they looked like they were, 3 to 5 inches in length.
Yeah, no, that's them. And these things are they're just nutty. They can dig a burrow anywhere there's dirt. And then the zebra mussels, they have a relationship with zebra mussels, which is kind of interesting, in that they're one of the few animals that will eat zebra mussels. So when you get those little itty bitty zebra mussels that cover everything, rusticus will go out into the, where they're at, and they just graze them like they're eating grass off the bottom of the lake, except for they're eating the mussels. So in that regard, okay, they're controlling the mussels. But it's a double whammy now because the mussels have impacted the lake because they're sucking out the nutrients that, a lot of the fry and then the algae and the little aquatic crustaceans that the fish eat. But then they supply, there's enough of them out there to supply this giant population of crayfish. So they basically keep it going, if that makes sense. But So moral of the story is just go get the crayfish from where you're fishing. I mean, that's it. And then follow regulations. I've helped with a lot of regulations. A lot of states will say, if you get the crayfish from where you're at, I'm talking about mid-Atlantic. I don't know what's going on down southeast, but up here where I'm at, you go to Lake A, you get crayfish from Lake A, you can use all those crayfish, but they don't want you going to a bait shop buying crawdads that they were brought in from, Texas to Maryland, and now you're going to potentially, at the end of the day, you don't know any better. You dump the 2 or 3 you got left over into the lake. Now we might have a problem.
We should send some rusties to China. Just for all the stuff that they send us. I think we should send them some rusty crawls.
They have the red swamps.
So do these rusties have a different, I guess, makeup as far as their shell hardness or their nutrient level to a bass than a standard crawfish?
Depending on which species is present.
Or they're just meaner than hell and the bass just don't want to eat them.
They're meaner than hell and the bass don't want to eat them. That's one thing. And then they get bigger, and bigger crayfish have more calcium carbonate. That's what hardens up their shell, and that's completely indigestible. Now, a lot of animals have adapted to deal with that. If you, up here where I'm at, there's flatheads all over the place. Mudcats, flathead catfish, whatever you want to call them. And if you cut one of those things open, you're going to eat it, and you look in the stomach, there's just crayfish claws everywhere because they're on the bottom, crawdad comes by, and I've seen some massive crawfish in the stomach of the flathead. So, but flatheads have adapted to eat these great big, large river species of crayfish that are down there. Bass are primarily targeting it depends on the size of the bass. Got to say that. But an average, whatever that is, foot long bass, 15-inch long bass, they're probably going to be targeting a crayfish that's total body length is around 2 inches total. And those rusties, they get to that size that Gary was talking about in about 8 months, whereas most crayfish will get to 2 inches in about 1.5 years or 2 years. So over the course of a non-invasive crayfish's life, if it's up in these lakes and that it's taking them a lot longer to get to that maximum body size, which means they're on the menu for the bass a lot longer.
Yeah.
But these rusties just outgrow them so quick that they're kind of, you got to have a big bass to eat those adult crawfish. Now, I will say one thing: bass doesn't know that. They're totally going to try to eat the crayfish. When I do my research, a lot of times we're snorkeling, and I have an absolute love-hate relationship with bass. Because I'll be crawling along the bottom with my snorkel, and I flip the rock up, and there's what I'm looking for. And here in Appalachia, it's always a smallmouth, and they follow you. The damn things know what I'm doing. They figure it out. I have punched many bass in the face. I flip the rock. There's what I'm looking for. And boom, it's gone. And then there goes the smallie swimming away. So now it's like flip the rock, and this hand's waiting. And it's just kind of a quick jab to make them go away. Then you grab the crayfish.
That's hilarious.
So, and I've totally let big crayfish go that I didn't need. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I see something going on the riverbed. And sure enough, there's this smallmouth that's like this big trying to eat a crayfish that's this big. And it'll just sit there and peck at it for the next 1.5 hours, and inevitably it gives up. But the crayfish normally just kind of put their claws up and deal with it. A rusty just keeps, jabbing away. So there's definitely a behavioral difference with them.
Let me ask you another.
Go ahead, Gary.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Another question with crayfish is that, bass, we kind of know their cycle, from the spawn, pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn. What is the cycle? And I know it's got to change from region to region across this country, but what is the life cycle of a crayfish?
Sure. There's two basic life cycles that we can talk about that are probably relevant to fishermen. So we'll do the easy one first. If you're in the deep south, in what I would call the coastal plain, so down, Florida, which isn't technically the coastal plain, whatever, but along the Gulf and along the Atlantic coast up to like Virginia, and then East Texas, all of East Texas, most of the crayfish there are in that genus Procambris, the one that the red swamp's in. And while they definitely have a defined breeding season and all that jazz, they also breed just in response to the weather. So if it's warm and it doesn't get too cold, they can potentially make eggs and have babies any month of the year. And that's fairly normal. And then most crayfish, if you were going to average it out, a female has somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 150 eggs. She lays those. And then crayfish are actually good parents. The mother puts the eggs up underneath her abdomen. We call that in berry. If you find a female and you pick her up and she's got eggs, she looks like she's got a raspberry underneath her tail. Oh. And so the babies hatch. They hang out on mom. In the deep south, which we're talking about right now, they'll probably be on mom for like a week, maybe two. And then they'll leave mom after they mold a couple times, and they just become part of the bottom of the lake or the bottom of the swamp or the bottom of whatever. And then they eat dead leaves, aquatic vegetation, and any living thing they can eat, they will try to eat. They lose their damn minds for protein. And then they just grow. And down south where it doesn't really get too cold, they just keep growing. So they can go from a baby to an adult in like 3 months without any problem. When you get up to where I'm at, mid-Atlantic region, over the Ozarks, you get out of that kind of warm southeast part of the country, things change a lot when it comes to life cycle. And in that scenario, in that part of the world, you have almost something similar to what bass have. What most crayfish do is they molt, and that's how you get your soft craws, is they shed their exoskeleton. And when they shed that exoskeleton, a lot of them will shed it just because they're getting bigger, but several crayfishes shed it in response to the season. And so if you need to go get a bunch of soft-shelled crayfish for whatever, and there's one group of crayfishes which I would encourage y'all to learn. Unfortunately, like I said, there's not easy names, but the genus name is Sineius, Faxonius. That's what the rusty crayfish is. And we're just going to talk about those guys because they're relevant. Those animals will have 2 mass molts over the course of the year, and those molts are in response to mating in their life cycle. They have a big molt, normally coming out of winter, going into spring, okay? And then they have another big molt, usually the end of July through August. And basically what happens is the entire population for many of these animals molts. And this is the same strategy that the 17-year cicadas use, where basically there is nothing on earth more useless than a soft-shelled crayfish. They can't do anything. In fact, when we keep them in tanks, you can have a 3-inch long crayfish molt, and there can be a 1/2-inch long crayfish in the tank with it, and it will eat the giant crayfish and have its revenge. And that little bastard will just kill every, there's no way it can't defend itself. So because of that, the crayfish know we're just going to all molt at once. So the first wave of molting crayfish, they're the ones that get eaten, and then everybody's fat and happy. And then the middle wave and second wave are the ones that get to live. Okay, so that's why they do this way. But they will mate coming out of the winter and through the fall. The females then normally lay their eggs sometime in May through June. And then you get all these baby crayfish entering the population end of June, middle of June. And then those little crayfish that enter the population at like half a centimeter long, they'll be that golden size, the size that I like to use as bait, by August, September. And that's right around an inch, inch and a half. Any bass can eat a crayfish at that size. And that is the one time a year or when those rusty crayfish are actually heavily consumed by bass. They can get past them because when they're that size, they can fight all they want. The bass is going to eat them. It's when they get to be really big and they got big claws that the crayfish can fight back. And they normally will do that every year. And then those Sineius crayfishes, they live, we think, to be 2 to 3, and a female can actually mate 4 months after she's born. So, and you'll get 2 or 3 spawns out of her. And then final thing is some of those animals can lay a lot of eggs. I had a funny story about that. I was studying another crayfish that can be invasive. It's called the viral crayfish. And we caught these in West Virginia, and I got some ovigerous females. Those are the females that have eggs. Brought them back to my lab, and I had a student, and she came in the morning, was like, what am I going to do today? And I was like, you need to count the eggs on those crayfish. And she was like, okay. So everything in the literature said they have 200 or 300 eggs, right? And so her name was Kinsey. Kinsey comes back to my office, and she's like, okay, the first one had 1,200 eggs. The second one had 1,100 eggs. The third one had 1,000 eggs. And then me being the scientist that knows all things, I was like, you've made a mistake. They can't possibly have that many eggs. Go do it again. And then she looked at me like, what? I was like, just do it again. Blah. And then she came back, gave me the exact same number. I was like, okay, 2 hours later. And then I went back in the lab, and sure enough, these animals had actually laid over 1,000 eggs. Now, that's the only time that's been recorded in the science of crayfish. But at the same time, it just tells you how many eggs some of these animals can have. Now, those crayfish that laid 1,000 eggs, they were almost as big as this legal pad. They were gigantic.
Oh,
so
my.
that's part of the reason why I was interested to see how many eggs they were having. But most of the time, they have 200 to 300 eggs.
Okay, so just so I understand you correctly,
Mm-hmm.
the rusties do molt twice a year.
Yes.
So even a larger rusty, when it's molting, they're completely vulnerable to be eaten by bass at that point, right?
They're vulnerable, and when they reach that high density, I'm certain that they're being eaten, but they're also going down in their burrow and staying down in the burrow when they molt, and they're going.
Oh, so they don't molt in open water.
Well, yeah, no, when they molt, they do everything they can to not be in open water.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're hiding during that period, and it only takes them about a day or two to get to a hardness point where they can then defend themselves again. They're not going to harden all the way up, but they're going to be hardened to a point that they won't necessarily be predated on by another animal immediately.
Since these rusties are so invasive, are they good for human consumption?
That is a great question. I am a complete advocate for eating the bastards. I have done this.
I agree.
But you try to, it's been tried, and a couple states tried to promote it, and it just doesn't take off. The problem with crayfishes is they gather up heavy metals and they do all that. And, there's that tradition in New Orleans where you suck the head and you rip the part off. You do not do that. You are slurping down. You might as well be mainlining mercury when you do that. It's bad. You're also sucking up more worm eggs and worms than you ever wanted to in your life because they're all in that organ.
Man, Mike, we're not good, okay? Because I know you
don't do that.
Gone through some crawdads.
If they're in Louisiana,
I don't do that.
The Cajuns can make them delicious. I know this.
Yeah. Just don't do that. That's not cool. But if you get, we call it a vein. That's also funny to me. It's the intestine. It's basically, that crayfish crap in that tube you see. But if you devein them and you pull that out, it's just muscle tissue. So it doesn't really biomagnify that much because these crayfish grow so fast that by the time you're pulling them out, they're only a year old max. And in that point in time, they haven't biomagnified the chemicals. But I did a survey in West Virginia, and we were on a reservoir, Sutton Lake, which is on the Elk River, and there were gigantic viral crayfish, those invasives. And the way we were catching them, they were out in deep water and we couldn't get them. And back then we always had 2 or 3 people with spinning rods in the university van. And so we went out. I was like, all right, we're gonna go out at night. So we went out at night, and sure enough, there they are doing what they do because they're nocturnal. And I just got a dozen night crawlers, and we would just cast out past the crayfish with a split shot right up on the hook, and then let it drop right on their face, and then they grab it, and then we would reel them in, net them. And we were having too much fun doing that we ended up filling a cooler with them. And, here I am. We can't put them back because, I'm preaching from the mountaintops. Can't release them. So we brought them back to the hotel. They lived in the bathtub for a day. So they crapped all over the bathtub in the hotel. And then we had a bunch of Miller High Life that was left over.
Oh, yeah.
So we basically boiled them in Miller High Life, and it was the best crayfish I've ever eaten in my life. Because I didn't want to preserve them because we only had so much alcohol, and each one of those things take up a jar. So, no, I've totally eaten the invasives. I put my money where my mouth is on that one. and they're good. And some of those things get big, too. I mean, they're not tiny. There was quite a bit of meat on those. So, yeah.
Sounds like a money-making operation to me. I think somebody needs to start just a full-blown crawfish invasive roundup up north, and let's eat some crawfish.
Yeah, totally. No, I endorse that 100%. Done it myself.
What happens to their coloration when they molt?
When they molt, coloration is an interesting subject. So coloration is determined by what they are eating. When they molt, they definitely are brighter after they molt. What a lot of people don't realize is that exoskeleton they have, there's all these different crazy little microscopic organisms that land on a crayfish and they live on a crayfish. And so they can take a bright blue crayfish and turn it jet black. Or they can take that same bright blue crayfish and make it brown with this process we call biofouling. So, but when they molt, they come out nice and pretty. You can make a crayfish neon if you deny it these chemicals in plants called carotenoids. And carotenoids are just basically that's what makes carrots orange. It's what makes leaves red and orange and yellow. And basically the crayfish eat the carotenoids when they eat the leaves, and then that gets in their exoskeleton, and that's what holds their color. When you deny them the carotenoids, they end up turning this weird neon coloration. Right now we're working to propagate some endangered crayfish, and the biggest problem we have is we can grow them in tanks in a hatchery without any problem. We haven't dialed in the diet. So we end up releasing these things that literally look like living pieces of power bait, which is about the worst thing on earth. One of the most awesome / horrifying moments of my career. We spent forever trying to raise these endangered crayfish. We raised them. We went down to the Tug Fork River in West Virginia. I got my mask, my wetsuit on. I go down to the bottom of the river, and I let this crayfish go. And at the time, they were a little bit more blue than they needed to be. And, I was like, all right, these are fine, whatever. They're a little blue. Holy hell. When you put them in the damn water, they glowed. And so here I am. I released the first one of these endangered crayfish, have this, magical moment, and then, boom, the smelly just showed up and drilled it. I mean, it was, immediate. It came out of my hand and was gone. And then the guy next to me was like, okay, well, I'm going to let mine go. And then sure enough, and then I was just doing that thing where I'm punching the bat in the face again. But yeah,
more blue,
color
more blue.
Right crayfish, I can flat out tell you the smallmouth, I can't speak for largemouth. The smallmouth can see them like a quarter mile away. It was crazy. And these were, and my inner fisherman was like, damn, that was a nice fish. But at the same time, it just ate this animal that we're trying not to have go extinct. So anyway, but yeah, no.
So I guess a little bit more on coloration.
Yep.
So through the life cycle of a crawfish, do they change colors every time they molt?
Yeah. Yes, most crayfish, not all. Most, when they're born, and until they get to be maybe 3/4 of an inch long, they're going to be some kind of drab, earthy color. They're going to be brown or olive green. And then they're going to have a lot of striping and spotting. We call it, where I come from, reticulation. So they got a lot of reticulation. And that is just basically there to make them blend into the bottom of the whatever water body they're on. As they get bigger and they get the ability to defend themselves, that's when we start to see these color patterns start to pop. And what's really interesting is people don't realize it, but there's actually like 3 or 4 basic patterns, if you will, that a crayfish will have. With those patterns, the color scheme can change, but the pattern doesn't. So they'll get these things on them. We call them saddles, where you get basically a black band that goes up over the animal, and you oftentimes will get a black band right in the middle of the carapace or the main shell, and then you'll get another black band where the tail meets that shell. And we think that that's an adaptation to help break up their to basically add contrast so that when they are moving, it blends them into everything. I can tell you, this is just a hunch, but I've spent hundreds of hours snorkeling in rivers. I really honestly think that that's what the fish are honing in on, is that those 2 color bands in particular, because the species that have the bands, I've seen those get eaten by a lot of fish. The species that are more what we call monotypic, where they're just kind of brown or they're green or they don't have a bunch of color patterns to them, they have a tendency to just kind of plod around on the bottom of the river and get to where they need to go. And I don't see them get consumed the same way I do those animals with that pattern. And the other thing about the ones that have the bands, they're the species that have swimming as a defensive strategy. So when you're using a jerk bait, or you're imitating a crayfish, and you kind of do that thing where they kind of come up off the bottom and they come down like this, that genus you're imitating is Sineius. That's the one I keep talking about. And those are the ones that have the 2 bands. So if you're going to do anything to a lure, I would say making it have contrast, making it be a little bit blue, and making it have those black bands probably going to be pretty advantageous for you.
Doctor, let me stop you right now, give you a little friendly advice. Mm-hmm. In about 6 months to a year, you're going to see a bunch of baits being put out by Spro and Pure Fishing. Send them a bill.
Yeah, will do. I was thinking about that as I was saying that, for the record.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Well, these guys right here, we're on the show with you. They're wonderful people. I've cherished my time with them, but they are grabbing every bit of information you give me, and you will see it on the market next year.
Gary's actually making skirts right now.
Oh, I
can't see his hands.
Yeah,
I'm taking notes.
Sitting here making them, but no, the conversation is phenomenal, because when I listen to you talk about the crayfish, like Mike, we're reminiscing on our experiences, what we've experienced on the water. And there's a lot of times over the course of our cruise where you go out there and you try to catch fish that are looking up.
Yeah.
But the fish are on a crawdad bite and they're looking down, and you'll miss those fish. You'll fish right over the top of them. And I've seen so many times where I know Mike loves to fish a jig as much as I do, whether it's a football head and we're just reeling it on the bottom, or we're trying to pop it up or snap it around the aquatic, again, trying to imitate a crayfish, a reaction. And, we're trying to get a reaction strike from the fish. But one thing I will say with my experiences in jig fishing is that a lot of times an angler that's fishing a jig when he feels the bite, because now our rods are so light, our fluorocarbon lines are so sensitive, they set the hook too quick. Because my experience has been on a jig bite, never set the hook until you feel the weight of the fish, because a lot of times a bass will go down and actually just try to injure the crawdad on the initial hit and use his jaw to crush it into the ground, spin around, and then grab it.
That's absolutely true. So the animal behaviorists have studied the flight response of crayfishes, and they've studied how fish interact with crayfishes. And in my world of academia, we call this a stylized behavior, which basically means when this opportunity presents itself, this is the way the animal is going to react maybe 95% of the time. And with a crayfish, when they get scared, startled, whatever, depends on the species. One genus, the genus I do actually most of my work with, which is the one that lives in Appalachia. They're big. They live under big rocks. They don't have a tendency to do what I'm about to talk about. They get scared. They kind of go, put the claws up, and then they just scuttle to the closest rock they can find. But these Sineius species, these procamber species, whenever they bump into anything that they don't like, their initial response is to kick straight up, and then they come down. And when they come down, they actually spread their legs out, their claws out, and they'll come down at an angle or they come straight down. And they're kind of perceiving their environment, and they're actually using their antennae and all these little pores on their body to smell what's in their environment. And they actually smell the fish. So the fish is what, they may even pick up the smell of the fish, which causes them to do that reaction. Well, fish, when they see the crayfish go up, they will oftentimes just innately grab them. And you nailed it, because they just grab them. They just are holding them. They're not even doing anything with them. And then they have about a split second, 3-4 seconds, where they're going to decide, am I going to spit this thing out? Am I going to swim over here and drop it? I'm going to move it off my bed if I'm spawning, or am I going to eat it? And that's where the size of the crayfish seems to really matter, because if it's small, they're going to eat it. If it's a large crawdad, they're probably going to do a cost benefit thing in their little fish brain and be like, I don't want, my stomach to get pinched and hell back. I'm just going to spit this thing out over there. So the size of the crayfish when the fish hits it is really what's going to drive whether it's going to be consumed or not. And like I said, that like 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches total body size, most decent bass are going to eat that. Like, that's protein. I startled it. I got it. There's no reason to let this thing go. It can't hurt me. It can't hurt my eggs. It's dinner. So that's a key part of their biology.
Zach, is most of this that you're coming, is this based on river smallmouth? How much like largemouth?
It's based on both, to be honest.
Okay.
Because largemouth on a bed and smallmouth on a bed kind of doing the same thing. Now largemouth are they're just a more aggressive fish, and their gape is larger, so obviously the more things are on the menu for them. But yeah, no. That's a really interesting thing. One of the things that when I talk about those bass coming in and grabbing the crayfish when I'm trying to catch them, I've watched them just swim around with them in their mouth for like 10 minutes. They're not trying to swallow them. It's like a dog with a bone. Like, I got it. Right. And they're just holding the damn thing. In fact, one time I creeped along the bottom of Dam River in North Carolina, slowly following this bass, and inevitably dropped the crawdad. And I was like, all right, I got it. Anyway, but yeah, no, there's a lot to do with how they're reacting to crayfish, because not just because they got the crayfish in his mouth doesn't mean they're going to swallow it.
Right.
So I've got another question about the molting, I guess molting and spawning are two separate things in crawfish, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when typically is there a water temperature and is there a depth? Like bass have to come to where there's sunlight available to spawn. Yep. Is there a particular depth and water temperature that these crawfish spawn at, and what water depth do they do it at?
They can spawn. They can spawn at any water temperature if they're in the south, because it's going to be warmer. But they will normally start, activating when the water temps get up around 48, 50 degrees. That's when you're going to start to see the beginnings of the molting cycle, and then that leads to the eggs and all that kind of jazz. Now, what's really intriguing is those mud bugs we were talking about in the ditches. They are actually adapted to be cold adapted. They're cold adapted. Like when I go out to sample those, and I don't want to shove my arm down into a hole, and Lord knows what's down there. We set our traps up here in West Virginia. I'll go out right after Christmas, the beginning of the year. I'm out there with a freaking mattock breaking through ice, and then I'll put the traps in, because the crayfish they're up, they're moving around under the ice, and I get them. If I put that same trap out in the river, I'm not going to catch any crayfish, because those crayfish are not cold adapted. They're just basically hunkered down. They're not doing anything. They're literally like lights out. If you go out and catch one, then a lot of times they just roll along the bottom of the river.
They're lights out around 38 degrees.
Mm-hmm. Yep. When you get down around 35 degrees, they're not really doing much anything. But these burrowing species up here where I'm at are totally running around under the ice. And that's, here again, not all crayfish are created equal. down south, the crayfish that are along the Gulf and in Florida, they're not really going to become inactive until your water temps get down to around 50. And if your water temps are getting down to around 50 in Florida, you got a problem. So, so they're just, trucking along all year long.
What about the Midwest region? The
Same
Ozark?
thing as me here in Mid-Atlantic. If you're up in like Arkansas north, Oklahoma north, when it gets down around, when the water temps get down around 40, 35, they're totally not doing anything. But then when you get that warm up, that's the trigger that tells them, okay, it's time to go. Now, the depth of the water is going to have, obviously, determines your temperature. So when you're up in that middle part of the country, most of the spawning, most of the crayfish population is going to be active early in the season. It's going to be in water that's 30 feet or less. Now, there's totally crayfish down in the bottom of the river. People have sent down drones in some of the Great Lakes, and they've gone down to like hundreds of feet deep in the middle of summer, and then sure enough, there's a crayfish scuttling around on the bottom. So we know that they are down there, but those are likely old adults that have just basically made their way down there, and that's just where they live now.
They got lost.
Most of the crayfish population is going to be centered up around the shore of the lake into about 30 feet of water.
So if I understand correctly, Doctor, I've always read about crawfish hibernating, but they don't perhaps actually hibernate. Is that right? What would be the best way to depict that?
They do something called estivate. So animals that estivate they don't just shut down. Like true hibernating animals, they shut down. They're not doing anything. Doesn't matter what happens. But if we get a warm up, crayfish will totally become active again in the middle of the winter. When I have the past couple winters that we've had up here where I'm at, they've been really weird winters. We get these like 2-3 weeks where it's like hot and negative 10 degrees, and then 3 weeks later it's like 55, 60 degrees outside in February. And we've totally gone out to little streams, try to get a jump on some projects that we had to do, and there's the crayfish. It's very water temperature dependent. If the water temp gets up to about 48, 50 degrees, they're active.
And on the other side,
up into like 55, 60 degrees, they're fully active. Like that's golden temperature for them.
On the other end, you mentioned that when it gets hot and there's less dissolved oxygen in the water, that they will come to the surface and breathe the air.
Yes.
Is there a temperature that is so high that crawfish activity is basically nil?
Yes. When you get up into the mid 70s, up for where I'm at, around 80, that's when you're going to start seeing these. I got to get out. I got to get to the water's edge and breathe. Now, the species that are down in Florida, of course, they've adapted to be in water that's that warm. But if you actually go out and pay attention to where the crayfish are, most crayfish are going to be hanging out in water that's like a foot deep, and they're going to be in weed-choked habitat. One of my favorite things to do in Florida is go to the Gulf side and around Orlando and snorkel in the springs and everything. And if you can you get down in that deep water, there's crayfish down there, but the water's cold. But if you get up along the margin, there's crawdads everywhere. So they're following, just like bass do, they're following a temperature gradient, and that's where they're going to be. And obviously, where the crayfish are going to be, that's where the bass are going to be that are eating the crayfish. So you've got this really cool relationship.
You're taking me right down to another area I wanted to explore here, and I don't want to interrupt anybody who's got another question, but you talk about where the crawfish are found in Florida, a foot or less, maybe up around the weed-choked areas. When I think of crawdads, I'm looking in places that are rocky and stuff like that. How about some good general guidelines for where people can find areas where bass are likely feeding on crayfish? Yeah.
So crayfish need cover. And ideal scenario for crayfish anywhere is a pebbly, cobble, small slab rock type habitat. When you get into just sand or a muck bottom, the crayfish become few and far between. Now, what's interesting is if you're in a sandy bottom stream, like Eastern Virginia and Eastern North Carolina have a lot of streams and lakes that are just sand, right? If you get to any island of cover, there will be crayfish there. I've spent a lot of time looking for these damn things, and in those sandy bottom streams, I don't even try to find them. I just keep walking until I find a rock, and then I say some choice words that it's taken me this long to find one damn rock, and then I flip the rock and there's crying. So, what they will do though is if you have a stream or a lake that has a vertical wall to it, and there's a mud substrate, not sand, it's mud. They'll dig burrows back into that mud, and they'll be there. There was one situation where I was in East Texas doing a crayfish survey, and I was in the Neches River, if you know the Neches, and that was fun because I didn't have a boat, so I was just, jungle gymming like a freaking monkey with the roots along the side of this river, which was just stupid, with a dip net in my hand. Everybody had to be thinking I was literally insane. And I would get to where I could jab the roots, and where the roots build up and there was mud, there were crayfish literally everywhere. Like I would shove the net back into there, and they were pinging off my legs. But until I got to that habitat, they weren't anywhere to be seen. So they're seeking out places where they can dig their burrows, or they can just go under something. Now, the good scenario is if you can get a great big leaf pack. And this happens in lakes, and this happens in rivers. You got a stand-bodied stream, you get an eddy, and leaves and detritus and brush start building up. That's like mecca to crawdads too. And they will be there. And I can flat out tell you, when I jab those leaf packs, is what we call them, I find so many little baby bass and panfish and rock bass and all the centrarchids. They're all in there. And they're all in there because crayfish are in there. So that's another thing. If you target a leaf pack on a nondescript bottom, you'll probably get some crawdads there.
So going back again to the depth that these crawfish are found, and you've mentioned water temperature variances. So like on our lakes in the Ozarks, we have a thermocline that forms in the summer. So can the crawfish, like, we truly believe that like most all existence in those lakes that have a thermocline is above the thermocline or at the thermocline. Can crawfish, you said that they need to get into highly oxygenated water. Can crawfish live below the thermocline? Yes,
totally.
They can live below the thermocline.
Yeah, in like July, August, because the thermocline temp will change too. It creeps up by 5-10 degrees in the peak of the summer, and then goes down 5-10 degrees in the depth of winter. But if your lake starts going anoxic at all, or your surface temps are in like the mid 80s, there's a good chance that the craws are hanging out down in that thermocline. Now, you got to understand, they're going to be right at the thermocline, because as you go deeper in the water, it gets colder and colder and colder, and then it'll like max out. But if that thermocline's holding it like 50, that's actually a great temperature for crayfish. Now, during that time of year, they're kind of programmed to be up where that's when they're eating, so they may not want to be that cold. But if the lake starts going anoxic, you'll get this thing we call overturn. And the crayfish in that scenario are going to follow the oxygen. So they're going to head down low. It's where you're down in the deep south where you just don't have a thermocline. And it starts to get too warm. That's when they say peace and they're out. So.
And can all crawfish burrow? All species?
The short answer is to some degree. Now, some of these things dig burrows that'll blow your mind. So the burrowing species in the ditches, those are some of my favorite, because that's like hand-to-hand combat to get those bastards out of the ground. And it's a challenge, and I encourage anybody to do it once. But people think, oh, they're just digging a hole. It is not a hole. I dug burrows that were 9 feet deep, and they were still going. And I basically just hit a layer of clay. I couldn't dig anymore. And I've gotten one animal, I know it was in 8 feet, because it was in a high wall to a stream in Indiana, and I could just basically dig along the bank of the river, and sure enough, 8 feet down at the bottom, where I made it 6 feet down to the creek, and then it went 2 more feet down into the ground. So that's the deepest burrow that I personally have done.
Wow.
So those animals have crazy adaptations for them to burrow. The crayfish we keep talking about, the procambrous, they can burrow in muddy, mucky substrates. The Sineius are the ones, and these are the ones that are in the Ozarks. In fact, the Ozarks are known for Sineius. Oklahoma as well, Midwest. They are the ones that aren't the best at burrowing. And what they do is, and you've probably seen this if you've ever walked along a creek, they'll find something on the bottom that they can basically kind of push sand out. And technically that's burrowing, but they're not building a tunnel and what we call a resting chamber where they sit. They're not doing that. The other ones are doing that. And they only do that normally in response to drawdown. So if they're digging a burrow and they're underwater, it's probably just a simple little shaft that leads to a little chamber. It's when they get up out of the water that they have to create these burrows that are they're doing a lot besides just being a hole in the ground. We now know they'll build the chimney. If you do this next time you see those chimneys, look around on the ground, because you'll find a chimney, and then right at the ground level there'll be a hole, an opening. Those are probably connected. When the wind blows over top of that, because one entrance is higher than the other, it creates negative pressure. So basically it sends fresh air down into the hole because that's what they're breathing. So they're like little engineers down there. It's crazy what all they're doing. But you don't have to do that if you're in the river because you got your water. So they're a little bit different.
That's wild.
Did I hear you right when you said that a newborn, from the time it's hatched, 3 months later will be ready to mate?
If it's a Sineius species in the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, most of the time they can do that. The procambrous also do that, the one that's down in the south. Those little boogers grow fast.
How many times a year will an adult female, or how many times will she have babies?
Great question. Most of the species in the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, they're going to lay 1 clutch of eggs. Okay? You're down in the south with those procambrous species, they'll lay a clutch of eggs. If they get enough energy back in them, a month or 2 later, they'll lay another clutch of eggs. And then if they get enough energy back into them, 2-3 more months go by, they'll lay another clutch of eggs. So they have the capacity to do that. Most of those species will do 2 clutches in a year, the species that are in the Gulf Coast and down in Florida. And depends on the which crayfish you have. Like on the Atlantic coast, from basically Orlando up to just north, like Jekyll Island. No, that's too far. Up to like Cumberland Island, St. Mary's. There's a crayfish there called the slow crayfish, and that species goes from a baby to an adult in about 3-4 months, and then she'll lay 3 or 4 clutches over the next 1.5 years and die. They got a 2-year lifespan. Up here where I'm at, these big gnarly crawdads that live in the rivers, we think that they can live to be 15 years old.
Whoa.
So there's a bunch of differences in life history as you go across these crayfishes. Great example, those really big crayfish in that genus Cambarus. These are the guys that if you're in an Appalachian stream, you flip a big rock and you're like, holy hell, I found the lobster. Like I get that all the time. I think that those are great to look at. They're fun. They're cool to put in a fish tank. They make crap bait because they're just these giant, monstrous things that are loaded up with calcium. They can pinch. It hurts. They can fight a fish off. And we've done studies now where we've put radio transmitters on them to see how they use the creek. And we've now learned that these things move like you would not believe. And so they're exposing themselves to predation all the time. And you don't do that if you're not going to win a fight. And so basically, we know that these big, gnarly crawdads, they're surviving. I put transmitters now on 50 adult crayfish for these 2 species that are imperiled, that are endangered. We have only had 1 die during the transmitter period. And to put that in perspective, when you put a freaking transmitter on a fox, like 25% of the foxes usually die. So these things are surviving. Like when they reach adulthood, they're living a long time, which is telling me that they're not being eaten when they get to be that giant size. Like
How
they're
far?
just dying literally of old age. Now that I'm talking about fish. A raccoon will eat them like a gumdrop, like, you know.
Yeah.
And the conditions have to be good for the raccoon to get into the river to be able to get them out of it. We had a drought up here, and I'm pretty sure that there was a lot of predation on the species that we work with because the raccoons were able to get into deep water where they couldn't get before, and that's where the crayfish were. But yeah. And another fun fact, I didn't know this. You know, I'm the crayfish scientist here, and I was blown away. We put transmitters on a couple crayfish, and in a matter of just over a month, they moved 2.5 miles upstream.
Upstream.
So, yeah,
Wow.
and they all moved upstream, which is kind of interesting. So
Wow.
these things are out. They're moving at night, and they're moving long distances, which was kind of shocking. I thought they find a rock and they live under it and we're done.
Yeah.
And that is not what they are doing at all. So
Why are they traveling? What's up?
I think that they're traveling as a mechanism to maintain their population density in the stream. So what we think they do to disperse in a river, and this is definitely relevant for fishermen, and we have a project. I think I got the funding to do this project this summer. So, you know, have me back and I'll be able to answer this question. But the females, when they have those young, a lot of aquatic insects and arthropods do this behavior to disperse their young, and it's called aquatic drift. So basically, at nighttime, what we think happens is the little crayfish, when they leave mom, they go out at night and they swim up directly. They're doing this intentionally. They're going up into the water column, and they're letting the river take them downstream.
Yeah.
And you do this during at night because your bass, and bluegill, and rock bass, and creek chubs, and all your diurnal day active predators are not active. So you can drift and not get eaten. But if you think about it, you're going downstream as a baby. And so when you mature, if you keep going downstream, everybody's going downstream. So what we think happens is they become, you know, there's a drive when they become an adult to go back upstream. And that way they're able to distribute themselves across the creek or the river. And if every population does that throughout a watershed, you have crayfish throughout the watershed. We know the adults are moving upstream. We have some anecdotal evidence that the kids are moving downstream. We're just going to hopefully put a nail in that coffin and hopefully support that, you know, idea this summer with these things called drift nets and going out at night. And there'll be a lot of catfishing and science at the same time. That's what we do.
Doctor, in the bass world, we got obviously, I think, 14 different species of black bass now. The largemouth, clearly the most widespread. It's in 49 of 50 states, thanks to bucket biology and everything like that. Are there any species of crayfish like that are pretty much everywhere in the country?
Yes-ish. The red swamps they're popping up everywhere, and then rusties have areas where they are definitely established, but now a lot of, you know, DNRs and fish and boat commissions have kind of, they realized that that's a problem and they've started to regulate them a little bit. And the areas where you get the rusties, Mid-Atlantic, New England has quite a few rusticus populations in it. And then Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, you know, the Great Lakes region has a lot because there's a fishery there. And so we find them in weird places. They're in Oregon now. And the way that they got to Oregon is kind of interesting because nobody's really fishing for bass out there in those particular rivers. These are salmon rivers. And so how the hell they get there? And the scientists were mapping the distribution, trying to figure out, like, what the hell, why are they randomly popping up? And then one of the techs for that project was just goofing around with GIS and just adding layers. And he added a layer for schools. And everywhere there was a school, there was a rusty population. And so then they found out that the Oregon, like every third grade in Oregon was doing this, have a crawdad in your classroom thing. And at the end of the school year, the teachers were like, I don't want to deal with this thing. and the instructions said to put it in the freezer. But you've got these kids that have like, I don't want to kill Skippy. So they just basically went out and dumped them. And then that's how we ended up getting the population there. So it's not always,
fascinating. BTC, I interrupted you. Had something.
I forget now. I'm all hung up on this woke crawdad in Oregon. But go ahead.
So, like, going back to, and I keep referring to leech because, I mean, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life as far as numbers of crawfish. I mean, there were literally places you would, like, be idling up onto a flat in water that was, 3 to 4 feet deep. And there would literally be hundreds of these things just scurrying all over the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
What were they doing at that point in time? Are there just so many of them that they're out feeding? I mean, it was
what time of year
daylight.
Do you know what month?
Oh, I guess we would have been there in August.
Yeah. So remember how I mentioned you get all those juveniles or babies? Those were probably that year's spawn of crayfish. And they had just basically reached the density at this point in time where they weren't being picked off yet by the fish. But they may have also gotten to the point where they overwhelmed the fish, and the fish basically were like, yeah, hell no, I don't want to eat these things anymore. Because you'll get that effect as well. But that was probably, that's what was going on. Now, other things eat the crayfish. If there's otters are stone cold killers when it comes to a crawdad. They lose their minds when they're a crayfish. That's their main, forage. Herons will eat them. Wading birds eat them. Snakes eat them. Turtles eat, like everything eats a crawdad. So other things would have probably moved in there and eaten them. But that's what my guess is that was that year's crop of crawdads, and they had just reached the size where they were free living and they were basically dispersing. And that's why you were seeing them out in the 3-4 feet of water. And I've seen that several times. If you really want to see something, go to the Susquehanna. That is, they can make a horror movie. So many damn crawdads crawling along the bottom. We use minnow seines to do our sampling. They're 8 foot long and 4 foot deep. And we did the entire state of Pennsylvania. So my lab has been in every single major river in that state. And when we were doing our seine hauls, which is put the net down, you have some guy up front kick for about 30, 40 seconds. Then he says, pick it up. And then 2 people pick the brails up. You got them. We were getting 80 to 100 crayfish per seine haul in that river. So, absolute insanity. And the reason why they were able to be that dense is that there was just a bunch of organic material in the river, i.e. crap. Like, they eat crap, by the way. That's one of their favorite things to do.
So there's
carnivores.
Somebody got them.
Omnivores and scavengers, it sounds like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you got a lot of productivity in your water. The crayfish are going to love it.
And they were rusties?
They were rusties, yeah. And one other thing, I hear people say this all the time on this note, when they're like, crayfish are biological indicators of clean water. No. These things can live in absolute filth. The most biologically diverse habitat I have sampled that had the most species diversity was this absolutely rancid. I was certain I got river AIDS, hepatitis, every freaking disease from mankind. And it was a roadside ditch outside of Houston. And it was not in a pristine forest. It was just outside of Beaumont. And we drug our net and there's 8 species of freaking crayfish in it. And then we kept going, and I think I got up to around 13 species out of that one ditch. So, they definitely prefer pristine water, but they don't need pristine water. And in fact, when the water gets polluted, if you're adding organics to the water, oftentimes you'll get a boom in crayfish because the baby crayfish have enough food to eat. Nobody starves. Everybody gets to adulthood. Now, chemicals and things like that, sure, that's a different story, but it always kind of makes me laugh when people are like, they're biological indicators. And I'm like, yeah, they're biological indicators of crap. There is a tremendous amount of crap in there. That's why you have so many, crayfish. They with these invasive species in particular, they need that.
What's the most predominant color in the crayfish that you work with?
That there's 3 colors that are
Green
predominant.
pumpkin.
Yeah.
Let Mike get his notepad ready.
Yeah.
I'm
I would
ready.
say brown to a forest or light green is one color pattern. That blue to brown on top, and then like an orange brown. And then the claws are also different. A lot of crayfish will have at the tip of their claw a black band. And we think that they may be using that as a mechanism of identifying each other when they first kind of stumble onto each other in the river, trying to figure out, is this my species? Because if it's their species and it's a guy, he's going to try to mate with her. And there's no conversation, there's no dating, it's just on.
That's what's up.
Yeah. So they have to have species level recognition, and we think that might be a mechanism for that. So,
It sounds like it would be very unusual for a waterway to have more than a single species of crayfish. Is that basically true?
most will have 3, but you're right, because one species will dominate one habitat. And so, if you think about a river, you've got shallow water, you have deep water, you may have slab rock, and then little cobbles. And so wherever you have a dichotomy, there'll be one species that's in A, and there'll be another species in B, and where those 2 habitats meet, you'll get some competition. And so as a general rule, if you're up outside of the Gulf coastal plain, and you're in rivers and streams and the reservoirs that are created by those rivers and streams, you'll have one group of species that are going to be under big flat rocks, and that would be that Cambaris, those big guys I was talking about that I think make horrible bait. And then in the kind of cobble, loose rock, scree, and the leaf packs and the veg, that's where you're going to have those Sineius species.
Got a political question.
More dense than the Cambaris.
I'm going to apologize for a political question, put you on the spot a little bit, Dr. Zac, but short of going out and catching all the species in your local waterway that you like to go bass fishing on, are the state DNRs usually a pretty good source of information on what crayfish are available in a fishery, or
really
they often fall short?
on the state.
Yeah.
I would say that.
So tell us who really
state,
sucks. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. What was that?
I said, tell us who really sucks, but I'm kidding. No, don't.
I'll tell you who's really good.
Excellent.
These are the people that give me my funding, so I'm not going to say they suck.
Fair enough.
There you go. States that have good crayfish programs, that you will be able to get some information. Missouri is definitely a good one. Arkansas just hired a great biologist. I talk with him about once every 2-3 months. And they had a good biologist before. Virginia definitely has it going on. The Carolinas are good. Pennsylvania's really good. Ohio's good. Michigan is good. But the deep South states haven't done that much work. And I'm the guy, like I said, it's both a blessing and a curse to be one of the few, because anytime anybody wants anything done with crayfish, comes to me. So, I've got to do a lot of traveling to places I wanted to go because nobody knew anything about the crawdads. But states like Florida, where you would think we would know a lot, we don't know anything. And it feels like every time I go snorkeling or do anything down there, not crayfish related, like I'm on vacation with my family, and I look down in a puddle, and I'm like, well, son of a bitch, you're here? And I know for a fact that nobody there knows what's going on. That's not, dogging on, what is it, FWRC or whatever they are.
The FWC.
They haven't had a crayfish biologist in a while.
Right.
Ken's still trying to get trout stocked in Florida. So
trout are being stocked in Florida, gentlemen. Rainbow trout are being stocked in North Florida lakes to grow bigger bass.
Oh, they will.
They are. They don't want them to last. They want them to be eaten. They don't expect them to make it into March, Gary.
They'll get conditioned to hearing the backup bell on the truck.
Oh yeah.
Contract when they open up the.
I'll be waiting with them. Doctor, this is awesome. Talking with Gary, a great friend of Gary and mine is a biologist in Texas, Stephen Barden. He's a terrific fisheries biologist, also the conservation director for Major League Fishing. He told me one time and reiterated it to me just today. He said there are times when studies have shown that bass prefer crayfish over all other forage by a ratio of even 30-1.
Yeah.
And commonly prefer it at a ratio of 8 or 9-1. Given the exoskeleton and the fact that some of these suckers fight back, how would you explain that?
They're targeting a particular age group of crawdad. That's
Okay.
what they're doing. Yeah. And we work with an endangered species. It's federally listed. It's in southern West Virginia. And this doesn't really have anything to do with bass, but we studied bass. And when the animal got listed, we had trout stocking in southern West Virginia. And, the DNR basically was like, well, we don't know if we can stock trout now because we don't know if the trout are eating the crawdads. And these are hatchery, rainbows, and brookies and browns. And they're kind of dumb. We'll just leave it at that.
They're dumb.
So they funded me to go down into southern West Virginia, and it was a fun project. We used backpack shockers, and we went up these streams that they stock with trout, and we looked at two things. We looked at the introduced fish, which were the trout, and then we looked at the native fish, and this is where the bass come into play. So every smallmouth that we got, we would then throw it in a bucket, all the rock bass, all the creek chubs. And we would then do this thing called gastric lavage, which basically means make a fish puke in a bucket. So we put a tube in its stomach, would hit it, fill it up with creek water, just kind of hit the plunger, and then blah, everything goes in the bucket. And the smallmouth bass, and starting in April, going all the way up to November, each month, there's plenty of minnows, suckers, darters, sculpins, all kinds of fish for them to eat. I think the lowest the percentage of crayfish being the primary forage for those bass got to was 80%.
Wow.
And when those crayfish got to be that magic size I'm talking about, the smallies, and there were spotted bass too. We had a couple of those. We had a couple fish where we opened them up, and sticking out of the back of their throat were two little crayfish claws. They had just been gorging on those crawdads when they got to be the right size. So, for my cropterus bass, the black bass is absolutely the case. Now, what was really interesting is the little red eyes or rock bass. We had a couple months where all they ate was crayfish. There was nothing else in the animals we got but crawdads. And that's why crayfish are so important. And you want to make sure you have a healthy crayfish population, because it is totally what is sustaining your fishery in a lot of situations. So if you don't manage the crayfish population right, you have the potential to make that go away, which is going to make those animals have some kind of population crash, which we don't want to have, because we want to be able to catch them. But
So,
no, definitely the case.
Do crawfish have any positives? I mean, other than sustaining, the life of a lake, for forage, do they clean the water up? You said earlier that they eat a lot of crap. Do they actually help filter waterways?
They don't really filter water directly, but they help to get rid of organic debris. So that's one thing they're definitely going to help. You have a fish kill. I don't want to give the impression that the crayfish are going to save the day, but they're going to be one of the things that can help to get that material out of the water before even worse things go down. But the number one thing they do is, in ecology, we have this term. It's called an ecosystem engineer. And these are animals that manipulate, their presence in the ecosystem leads to new habitat in the ecosystem. And what many people don't realize is the only real animal in the river that's digging in the bottom of the river are crawdads. Catfish and sculpins and some species of fish like drum, they'll manipulate the bottom of the waterway. But the crayfish are really the only thing that's down in there digging around, tunneling. When they make those tunnels, there's all kinds of fish that need to get down into a depression, down into a burrow when they're babies. And we don't ever think about baby fish. We always think about the big one we're catching. But that big one you were catching might have been living as a fry in a crayfish burrow for 2 months. And so if you don't have that habitat for those young of the year fish, you don't have the fish when they're bigger and badder and you're catching them. So that's one thing that they do. And then with that digging, they help to take nutrients that are locked in the substrate, and then they put them back up into suspension. And that's what our macrophytes need, our aquatic plants for the big beds that we all know and love. And that's a bigger deal when you get into the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic Northeast than it is down south, like in the deep south. But when you lose that crayfish population, or you replace the native crayfish population with rusties, which don't really do this digging as much, and they eat the aquatic the plants, you lose stuff. So they definitely do more than just service forage and food and stuff like that. So they are real important. I'm sitting in a room full of snakes, because that's what I initially did academically. And I would get up in front of people and give snake talks, and I would be like, we need the snakes. The snakes do all this stuff for nature. And, in the back of my head, I'm trying to think, like, what the hell are they really doing? But with the crawdads, I can flat out say with 100% certainty, their presence in a watershed and a water body is going to make the watershed / water body healthier. Like, they are definitely a needed ecological partner with all the other critters that are living in that stream, lake, river, swamp, marsh, whatever it is.
To ask another question really quick,
Sure.
Is there any water body in the States that is void of crayfish?
Yes.
Cool question.
What will get rid of crayfish quickly, there's two things that will just wipe them out. Like, they're gone. Thing number one is sedimentation. If you've got a bunch of extra dirt in your water, like in a river, creek, lake, if it rains and we go from clear water to murky chocolate milk, that's bad. And that will wipe out crayfish very quickly. And the reason why is real simple. It's not that difficult. That mud and muck, that silt, sediment, it fills in all the little spaces with the rocks, and then the crayfish don't have any habitat. And what will happen is the crayfish will spend literally their whole damn life just pushing that stuff out. They run out of energy and die. They're constantly being exposed to predators and get eaten and die. And that sediment carries with it some chemicals. And oftentimes, if you get conductivity that goes up, so the electrical charge in the water, your conductivity in the water has a direct relationship to calcium and carbonate and how it solidifies and hardens up. And so if you increase your conductivity, it basically impacts that process with them. And then it also impacts their ability to get oxygen out of the water for them to digest their food, because it impacts enzymes. Get a little technical, but anything that's going to make your conductivity spike is bad for them. And I have absolutely been in plenty of waterways doing my surveys, and you stand on the bank, everything looks great. I throw my data sonde in the water that tells me what's going on. I got high conductivity, and immediately I know, okay, might find them. I then look a little harder and see I got sedimented, impacted bottom. All right, they may not be here. Like, that's literally it. And it doesn't matter where you're at. If you have that combination, it's going to be a problem.
Dr. Zac, I want to get real fishing practical now. You're at least a casual angler, obviously, and I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of the conventional bass baits out there, crankbaits, jigs, things like that. What are we doing right? Maybe what are we doing wrong in terms of the crawfish imitating lures that you're familiar with?
I think that the action of most is good, that we're doing that right. But I think that when focusing on the presentation is the most important part if you're going to try to imitate a crawdad. If you have a little crankbait, and I had these back in the day where it looks like a little crayfish, you got the kind of claws going backwards and the spoon parts on the front end. If you're just reeling and that thing's going through the water, you're kind of imitating a crawdad, but you're really imitating a fish with something that looks like a crawdad, because that's not the way crawdads move. But when you're fishing a jig or something like that, and you're letting it hit on the bottom, you're pulling it slowly along the bottom, and then you do that quick pop, and then then it comes back down, you're going to have way more success, in my opinion, if you're doing that, because you're nailing the behavior, And like I talked about earlier, we know fish have an innate response to that. Like,
Right.
you could do that next to a fish that has no inclination to eat, and it's going to eat it. Whereas if you bring your crankbait by it, it's just going to like, what the hell is that? So that would be the main thing I would do, is just focus on the presentation and try to imitate that. And there's, if you're not catching any fish one day and there's crawdads down at the bottom of the lake and you can get to them, just start like tapping them with your fishing rod. Look at how they move. Because you'll see what I'm talking about, where they do the pop up and then come down, and then really just focus on your ability as an angler to present that way. I think that is the main element. And then one other thing would be, like we talked about, and I think Gary, brought this up. If you feel that hit, wait. I'm guilty of this. It doesn't matter if it's a 2-inch minnow or a 4-foot red drum out in the ocean. When I feel a strike, I do this thing, and I know I have yanked the bait out of many fish's mouths. So I think that it's super important to be, disciplined and wait till you feel that initial strike. Wait a little bit until the animal has swallowed it, and then or gotten it further back into its mouth, because you don't want to, hook them in the top of the esophagus or anything like that. But yeah, no. That would be that would be what I would say on that.
Yeah, in our world, we kind of, Mike and I call that a directional change. Anytime you fish in an artificial lure, you mentioned the crankbait. I know Mike's one of the best in the country at throwing his rock crawler crankbait, and it's designed to actually be fished on the bottom.
Yeah.
And the way he had that lip designed, it roots. But we're also fishing angles with our boat so that, we're coming over something or coming into contact. And it gives it that directional change, which, mostly will trigger their strike.
Yeah,
so,
no.
There's a lot more than just lure on throwing it.
What was that?
There's a lot more than just tying on a lure and throwing it.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, every lure is a tool. And that's the reason we have so many different depth ranges and sizes. And, you mentioned the size of crawfish being such a big deal. I mean, we essentially have two sizes of rock crawler. You've got the 55 version and the 50. And in my opinion, those are both that magical crawfish size, morsel that we're looking for. And then we've got, the different depth ranges. We've got baits you can fish from basically 4 feet out to 13 to 15 feet, so we can cover all depth ranges, within that realm.
Yeah, you already have the black bars on yours too.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Crawdad, I got a story here, and I need a ruling on this. So,
Sure.
What's your thought on this color? Now, you got a little, let's say, we got brown
I think
here.
that's a good color.
We got some green here, and then there's red.
I would put that at good. So,
how about, is that close to a rusty crawl?
No.
So here's the story. My buddies own Bass University, and I used to work for them. And one of the last things I did when I was over there, they worked with Tackle Direct, and Tackle Direct wanted an exclusive color missile D-bomb. And Pete Glusick, he threw it to me. He said, BTC, come up with a color. And I had heard that the rusty crawl was taking over the Chesapeake. So I looked it up and Googled rusty crawl. And that's what me and John Cruz came up with, something that was supposed to be close to it. And then, and this is about 2 years ago. And then like 2 months ago, I get a text message. Tackle Direct sends out these messages and emails or whatever. But I saw this message and I clicked on it because I had a suspicion, and there it was on clearance. my damn rusty crawl, dude! That hurt me so damn bad, man. So was it because that doesn't look like a rusty crawl, or they just don't want to eat it?
I think it might be a little tiny bit of both, but the color would need to be more blue, like turquoise blue.
Okay.
And then have a dot on it, not be like you got the color of the spot, but it needs to be more isolated to one spot because that rusty color is not on the whole crayfish. It's only in one little area.
Yeah. Don't worry, no fish were harmed with this bait.
Okay, there you go.
Doctor, a question that Stephen Barden, our fisheries biologist friend, texted me during the show here. He was curious about whether crawfish are or have been identified as a host for largemouth bass virus. Any information on that?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you.
Right.
I will say, now, disclaimer, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, that's not in your wheelhouse. That's not something you.
I wouldn't be shocked if they are, because it seems like every organism that has a pathogen that it wipes them out. If you start looking at crawdads, they invariably are carriers of it. With amphibians, there's this thing called chytrid, and what oftentimes happens is you get an established crayfish population where you didn't have one before, and then the next thing you know, all the frogs died. And then when you look at the crayfish, they were infested with chytrid, and chytrid doesn't do a damn thing to a crawdad. There's a couple shellfish diseases, like black spot and stuff like that, where it'll either jump from shrimp to crayfish or crayfish to shrimp. But I don't know if it's actually been screened. I'm sure some fisheries program has, but I haven't heard anything specific to that virus.
Have they hosted any Diddy parties?
No, not to my knowledge. Hopefully not.
Good.
Well, you'd be the guy who would know. I mean, you're the expert. So
Yeah.
we're gonna give him a free pass to the Diddy parties.
Yeah, no.
This has been fantastic. I really thought we were going to be talking more with Gary and Mike about some techniques and retrieves and things like that, but then they turned into co-hosts with us and started peppering you with questions.
Easiest show we've ever done.
Yeah.
Well, Big Ken, how often do Mike and I have the opportunity to sit down with an expert and learn? I mean,
this has been one of our most fun shows.
Well, but that's one thing that you know as well as anybody, Ken. I mean, we are students and we're constantly learning, because just about the time that we as anglers think we know everything, there's nothing else to learn, then you lose your enthusiasm, you lose your passion. And I tell you, man, when you were raised the way I was from the surface up, and then you get involved from the surface down, man, it's like a whole new world, completely different. And everything, it's just fascinating to me. And one thing too that I didn't realize, again, a lot of this is coming from underwater footage, spend a lot of time with the camera. But I mean, one of the best habitats for crayfish that I've seen is what you were mentioning earlier, is aquatic vegetation. I mean, I was always thinking logs and rocks, which is good, but man, they love aquatic.
No, vegetation all the way. They're in there, they're eating it. It's like living in a house you can eat. Doesn't get any better than that.
What a great analogy that is.
You know what? I got some. Justin Kimmel brought this up to me the other day and said during a shad spawn, if you ever see the shad showing up cut in half, it's indicative of presence of crayfish.
Wouldn't surprise me because they're opportunistic. Like if something blooms in their environment and they can take advantage of it, they will. So you
wouldn't think to fish a jig during a shad spawn. However,
maybe, I don't know. Now I don't know if they can necessarily, like you said, cut them in half. They can certainly wound them, and they can certainly cut one that's already dead in half. I can see them doing that. But no, they'll come out in mass. I mean, they're opportunistic. Any scavenger, when it gets an opportunity to take advantage of anything, is going to. So wouldn't shock me at all if they did that.
That being said, typically in the Ozarks, when we have major dramatic changes in water temperature in the winter months, we have shad kills. And a buddy of mine and I mean, it can be the hardest time throughout the course of the winter to catch a bass when these shad are dying by the millions or thousands or hundreds of thousands, whatever it is. But it seems like when you finally stop seeing all the shad dying, that the crankbait bite or the rock crawler bite gets really good. And our theory on that is those shad that didn't get eaten when they were dying sunk to the bottom. And then even though the water's really cold still, it might be in the, the upper 30s, low 40s. It seems like the crankbait bite really would come on strong. Is that because even though that water temperature is cold, the crawfish being opportunistic come out and eat the dead shad?
There's probably the most cold adapted. I got to think about this. Most cold adapted members of the population would be coming out to eat them. Most of the crayfish probably aren't. But the other thing is you've got your fish that are just so, honed in that when they do see a crayfish out active at that point, when they're normally not active, they're going to monopolize that like you wouldn't believe, because holy hell, I can get one right now, if that makes sense. So it could also go the other way with that. That's what I would put money on, because I know that when the crayfish start to become active, that's the one time of year here with the only stream I fish in. I am not a professional fisherman. I don't know if I think I went fishing twice last year. Year before I did it about 24 times. But in the
have you caught in the last 2 years? In the last 2 years, have you caught more or punched more bass?
Punched more, absolutely, without question. I punched about 20 bass in one day. Yeah, definitely punched more bass.
There have been some great questions, but that might have been the best one tonight.
Yeah, 100% punched more bass than caught bass. I know
thank
that.
You.
So essentially, what you're telling me,
go ahead.
What you're telling me is that a bass should eat a rock crawler 12 months of the year.
Potentially,
not any other craw imitating lure, but a rock crawler. He was very specific.
A rock crawler they should eat 12 months of the year.
Yes. It's just all about presentation.
Spoken like a designer on commission, huh? Okay. And these especially these rusty craws, they sound dangerous. Should somebody be working on a script called Crawnado or something? I mean, these things sound like if they got larger, we should be worried.
All kidding aside, it's just I do think I understand that regulations suck. let me put it this way. Me being a scientist studying these things, I'm not allowed to pick one up until I have a scientific collecting permit in my hand.
Wow.
And I have to submit my study design, and I got to get that cleared by a committee, and then I've got to submit my CV, and I got to do all this stuff. Meanwhile, you all can go pick up a crayfish because you're not a scientist. So I got the regulation part of this out the wazoo. It drives me crazy as well, but when it comes to the crayfish, I do think it's real important that we make sure we aren't introducing these things into waters that they shouldn't be in, because the science is clear that some of these are gnarly, nasty invasives, and they'll do way more harm to the fishery than good. And, you can sit there and be like, oh, that's garbage. Well, go ahead and do it and watch your fishery crash. That's my response to that. So just, make sure that you're paying attention to that, because
so when did Ohio become the China of the United States?
What was that?
When did Ohio become the China of the United States?
You mean with us introducing species? All over the place?
Yeah, putting their dirty rusty crawl in everybody's water.
Yeah. Well, somebody figured out how to culture the rusties, and I think it was in like the late 70s, early 80s. People were growing them, and then the viral crayfish too. That's the other one. That's the big invasive. Those were introduced to Baltimore all the way back in I think it was 1860 for food. People were like, we need a big, hearty chunk of protein that's dirt cheap to make, because people were starving. So they brought those over, threw them in the rivers, and now we've got these problems. But they do. It's not all crayfish, but we don't want to experiment and get more bad crayfish out there. So just at the end of the day, you have extra crayfish, cut their heads off, throw them in the water. And this comes from the guy that loves crayfish. Best thing you can do.
How many states? I was actually at dinner tonight with a group of anglers here at this event I'm at the Missouri Invitational, and told them I was doing a show tonight with the crawfish expert. And one of the guys owns a tackle shop, and he said that they don't even sell crawfish as live bait. I think he said statewide in Missouri now.
Yes.
Is it regulated in a number of states that they can't sell live crawfish as bait now?
I don't know the answer to that. I think the answer to that is yes. But I know a lot of states, because the invasives are the species that are the easiest to grow, they're the ones that are oftentimes sold as bait. So the pet industry and the fishing industry are the two industries that are regulated when it comes to crayfish. And in reality, pet stores. So there's another crawdad we haven't talked about yet. It's not used as bait to our knowledge. It's this crazy. I mean, it's worth looking up. It's called the marma crab because it was this is a crazy story. It was a North American crayfish that was shipped over to Germany to be pets, not bait. And one of those things when it was in Germany literally mutated, and got the ability to self-fertilize and clone. And so now this crayfish, it reaches adulthood. They're all females. It's going to make 100 eggs. Those eggs are going to hatch 2 months later, 100 more eggs. Those are going to hatch 2 months later, 100 more eggs. And it somehow is able to do this with no genetic diversity. And so you put one of those into a lake and it makes you the point it's laying eggs. Now you got 201. And the next thing you know, boom, it's going to take over everything. And that's another one that people are a little bit afraid of because you get these invasives in, they wipe out that native population of crawdads. Now we got a problem because that's going to, the natives are the ones that don't eat all the plants. They don't kill the bass beds. They don't, they do dig the burrows that the fishes utilize. And they're the ones that are edible to the fish. And so that's why these regulations have kind of come into place. It's to make sure we don't get these nasties in the waterways because they do way more harm than good. And that's why a lot of bait, where the threat of invasives is high, that's where we're starting to see the bait regulation. And it's because literally there's examples. Like this isn't, I am a very pragmatic scientist. I'm not the biggest fan of this thing called modeling where you get a bunch of data and then you throw it into a computer and then the computer gives you an output and then we say, that's what's going to happen. And then I turn around like, that's not what's going to happen. But if you go out to a lake and you see that it crashed and it's got the invasives in it, we know it's going to happen. And that's where these regulations come from.
Hey, Gary Klein just shared this video with me. Gary, can you talk us through it here?
Yeah, this is the bottom of Mille Lacs in 30 feet of water.
Oh,
and these
cool.
are the rusty crawls that were on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And if you notice, though, I'm drifting in the wind. I'm in like 2 foot waves. So I'm running a 75-foot cord.
Wow.
So I'm trying to hold the camera in front of the crayfish, but he will not swim away. He'll challenge that camera.
He's being a rusty.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
But I was impressed, just the color of them.
No, they're really cool critters.
Yeah, and they're all over on the bottom.
Yeah, and they're in there grazing on those zebra mussel beds.
Exactly.
Yeah, you see them right there. Wow. Yeah, just what a timely video, Gary. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
I'm glad we were able to get that up there.
Jacob Morrison, pretty darn cool, isn't it?
Jacob Morrison, engineer extraordinaire. Actually, we also got a photo from a friend of the show, Frank Scalish Jr., and he said he saw this in Lake Mojave in October, just a month ago. And I think he's looking for an ID on that. Do you have any idea what that might be?
Crayfish.
I'm sorry?
Red swamp crawfish or crayfish.
Okay, so that's what we eat.
Yep.
Excellent.
And what lake was that in?
Frank Jr. said it's in Mojave.
What state's that in?
Yeah, Lake Mojave is the third
Arizona,
lake
right?
in the Colorado River. Yeah, that's Laughlin, Nevada. We just came.
Nevada. Sorry,
We
Nevada.
just had
And those were
USO.
introduced by people because Nevada, I think, has one native species of crayfish on the eastern part of the state. I could be wrong on that.
Wow.
They
Eastern
may
part?
also have a couple that are up north, but those aren't my expertise. Those are the Pacific Northwest crayfish. I don't bother with those.
Yeah, that one escaped a pot of boiling water, probably.
There you go. Mhm.
What body of water is on the eastern part of Nevada?
There's some rivers, and then you got those northern Rocky Cascade deals up in northern Nevada that kind of go, up.
Yeah.
West.
Yeah. What the hell's the name of the mountains up there?
So
Sure.
you can identify, basically, and I don't expect you can do it all off of memory, but literally by looking at any crawfish, you can identify it by its coloration or markings or something.
Yes-ish. To be a yes-ish is my answer because I say that and then somebody sends me a picture. I'm like, what the hell is this thing? I've literally had people send me crayfish and I'm like, I don't know what the hell that is. And then I figure out what it is. I'm like, son of a bitch, I named that thing. So, the one that I described. So, and that's telling you they can be quite daunting to ID at times. But most of the animals, I'd say about 80% of them, pretty straightforward in their identification. Once you kind of learn the tricks, and most of the identification is based off of shapes. You identify shapes first, different types of claw shapes. The little part that sticks up between their eyeballs that we would call a nose, that's technically a rostrum. The shape of the rostrum is important. What's going on the claws is important. And so you kind of look at all those combinations in the color pattern, you can get an ID.
Ruby Mountains there, Dexter. That's what I was trying to think of.
There we go.
Sorry. Ruby
Gentlemen,
Mountains.
I got to get ready and go wind the rock crawler around again tomorrow. Like the Ozarks.
With a lot more information behind it this time,
Yeah.
Mike McClelland.
Uh-huh.
Well,
Well, I don't know. I don't know if anybody else has got any more questions for anybody in the panel, but this has been a blast. If you
I've had
got
fun.
them, ask them because we're going to turn you guys loose. But thank you all so much. This has been incredibly informative. This is the first of this series we want to do on forage. The old line about if you want to know the owl, study the mouse kind of thing.
yes.
And Dr. Loughman, you've been a spectacular wealth of information, sir.
Yes.
No, thank you.
We need you to become an expert on gizzard shad, alewife,
Thread fin,
all the above.
golden shiners. No, we
I'll
got
get on
other-
that.
We got
Give me
other-
a year.
We're not going to come to you on snakes because if I have a snake near me, I scream like an 8-year-old girl.
Yeah, that's fine. They make you just as happy as a crawdad. So
Well,
No,
thank
this
you.
has been fun. I'm used to. I love doing this kind of stuff. So if you ever want to do this again, I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about crawfish. I like I like this stuff. I feel like scientists don't talk to people enough, so we just kind of live in our little silo, and we're not getting anything done if we're doing that. So if you
You're
have
one of the
questions-
most. You're one of the most human scientists we've had on.
Yeah.
No humans.
Yeah, I try not to
You
be an
exemplify the
android.
most human traits of a scientist that we've had on.
Thank you for making it so accessible so that even I can follow along. And it was absolutely illuminating and such a good time.
Yeah.
Gary, always a pleasure, my friend. Can't get enough Gary Klein.
Thank you.
We wanted to have you on the show, Gary, because not only are you an educator, you've taught generations of anglers how to catch bass, but you're also a student. I admire that about you so much. Mike, you've designed some of the greatest craw baits in the bass fishing world today. We had to have you on. You're the man.
Thank you, Mr. Duke. I appreciate that.
There's no question about it. And am I correct in assuming that maybe you have a little more ammunition the next time you go to the drawing board?
Oh, most definitely.
And I hope everybody had a good time tonight. I sound like the doctor did, and that means a lot to me.
No, thank you.
Appreciate that. All right, BTC takes everybody off the show. You have a special system for that.
That's right. Mike betrayed you 1 for 1. These baits for some rock crawlers.
1 for 1.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good luck tomorrow.
Thanks.
I appreciate
Appreciate
your time, buddy.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Doctor, you were awesome, dude. You were fantastic.
Thanks.
And
Truly.
yes, and again, a shout out to Andrew Hayes for pointing us in the right direction.
Sure thing.
But, yeah.
Anytime.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for letting us pick your brain, boy. I tell you, I'd like to pick this conversation up again.
I see that.
Done deal.
I mean,
dude.
I
I'll do
learned
it.
a bunch. Yes.
Mhm.
Thanks, Zach. Have a good
Yes,
night, buddy.
thank you.
Take care, Zach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gary Klein, I'm sending you the good doctor's contact information right now. How about that?
Perfect. Thank you.
And thank you, man. We've been wanting to have you on the show for some time. Always a thrill to talk with you. Always a thrill to visit with you. Looking forward to the next time I get a chance to hang out with you. And thanks for being not just a teacher, but again, a student of the game. That you're a role model to all of us
Appreciate
in that
that.
regard.
Thanks.
Absolutely the truth. Absolutely the truth. And to watch you and Mike engage with Dr. Loughman like that, and Brian and I were laughing. Brian shot
Well,
a
yeah,
text
I mean,
to me.
how often do you have an opportunity to pick somebody's brain that literally has, many years invested in the study of crayfish? I mean, there's more information there. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions that I'm sure I'm going to come up with, or I wish I would have asked. But what was really cool is to listen to him talk and then try to apply what I know as an angler and what I've experienced to what he's trying to tell you. And it's like, yeah, I can see that. One question I forgot to ask him is how big what's the biggest crayfish he's ever seen? 12 ounces, 14 ounces, or I've seen some big ones in South Louisiana that probably, 8 ounces or something, but
Wow.
yeah,
That's
Magnum.
an awfully big one. Well, you can ask him because I just shot you his contact info.
Awesome.
I bet he'd be happy to hear from you. I think I truly hope he had a good time on the show too, because I know that I learned a lot.
Stephen will probably reach out too. I mean, we're always thinking of stuff.
Yeah, Steven's a sponge on gathering information too, and of course he can't leave it alone. He's texting me questions during the show.
Oh yeah, he was texting me before the show even started. He goes, "Are you on tonight?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm going to do it." He was interested in hearing what they had to say.
We may get canceled after our top 10 tonight, Gary. We do a top 10 on every show, kind of David Letterman style. And tonight's top 10 is top 10 signs you are a woman angler. And could be dangerous. And I drew the short straw. I have to read it.
Yes.
No.
Yeah, I may be the equivalent of an untouchable very soon.
Gary, thank you very much, buddy.
Yeah,
Yes.
we appreciate you,
It
man.
was a pleasure having you on, man.
Hey, anytime. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Take care, Gary.
Okay.
Just so everybody here knows, one of the great texts I've ever received during the course of Bass After Dark was one I got from Brian the Carpenter a little earlier. He's just said, "Easiest show ever."
It's just chilling, dude.
We're just sitting there. Mike and Gary took over. It was awesome.
I introduced the guest, and Mike McClelland just jumped right in. It was easy. That was fun.
That was a blast. I say it a lot, but I really hope everybody listening and watching got as much out of it as I did, because I learned so much. And again, I'll come back to it. Andrew Hayes did a magnificent job interviewing Zac Loman. Spectacular.
Yep.
But I love getting the perspective also of guys who are experts in other aspects of the craw world, like Gary Klein and Mike McClelland. So I think that adds to the mix, and that's something you get on Bass After Dark.
Yeah. Yep.
But always watch Tackle Talk with Andrew Hayes.
Dang it. Come on, man.
That looked nothing like the animal I saw on the screen.
I will send you Google Rusty Crawl and tell me the first image that shows up.
All right.
And the second and the third and the fourth.
All right.
They all look like that. Maybe.
I have for a while been a student of the craws that live here in Florida, and they're funky looking. They're blue. I
Really?
mean, blue. Yeah.
Really?
Yep. And now I've got whole other ideas. I've been taking notes on what I want to do in design, in tying jigs and stuff like that for
Sapphire blue could be
crawfish.
key color up here on
Sounds like
a couple of unnamed bodies of water.
sounds like blue can be a big deal everywhere. From what the doctor was telling us, it sounds like that's just a player in the craw world.
The good
Hey,
doctor.
The good doctor, he was spectacular. My gosh, he was a good guest.
He was.
I almost felt bad for him because, it was just him being peppered with a lot of really good questions.
He loved it.
I think he did. I hope he
Yeah.
did, because he was
Yeah.
tremendous.
Yeah.
Hey,
He's the
sorry, go
most normal biologist, scientist. No offense to Stephen Barden.
we've got a lot of great biologists we've worked with on the show, and who
We
are
have.
personal friends of ours. I mean,
Yep.
my gosh, people like
But Dr. Zach
Stephen Barden and
yeah, but he exhibits
Mike Allen,
the most
Keith Jones,
most
Okay, go ahead.
human traits of all of them. Because listen, my son's a scientist of sorts, and they're different.
Your son's an engineer.
Engineer,
I guess that's a
yeah.
scientist. I guess that's a scientist.
Nanotechnology. He's an alien. A lot of these guys are very Vulcan,
Vulcan.
Yeah.
Well, we kicked this series off with crayfish, and we do, like Brian was saying earlier, we do want to take it to threadfin shad, gizzard shad, golden shiners, terrestrials, you name it. If a bass eats it on a regular basis, we do plan to cover it with the very best experts out there. And it's going to get done. Might take us a while, but we're going to get it done.
Yeah, that's right, Ken.
Shout out and congratulations to our buddy Kent Brown, who's been on the show a couple of times. He's the host of Ultimate Bass Radio Show out of California. Kent hits a milestone next week with his 1,000th show on November 23rd. That episode is going to feature an all-star list of anglers that have been instrumental in the show's past and helped build its massive following. So you can check it out on Apple Podcasts at Ultimate Bass Radio. Again, Kent Brown, congratulations. Great friend of the show, great person, amazing bass historian and expert.
Outstanding.
We only lack about 950 of getting there, so we're hot on his heels.
We're hot on his heels. That's right. What else we got, Ken?
Whoa!
I love this. You get to stick around.
I got to stick around and get canceled. Well, one thing we got bad news.
Is it time?
It's up to you, man. You're in charge.
And now it's time for bad news.
What's up, everybody? Thank you for spending your Thursday evening with us here on Bass After Dark. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode on crayfish, crawfish, crawdads, whatever you want to call them. I'm Justin Kingsley. This is Bad News, and let's get to the latest headlines. A new scam is growing in popularity on social media as accounts pretending to be professional anglers are selling merchandise using the angler's name, image, and likeness. As anglers put an end to this new trend and sellers realize they can't sell the shirts, an abundance of unwanted, unsellable t-shirts are left over with few options on what to do with them. Well, talk about adding insult to injury. Kids in Africa are set to receive the overstocked t-shirts to go along with their Harris Waltz hats and Yankees World Series championship gear. Nominations have opened for the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame 2025 class. For the first time, any interested person may nominate deserving individuals to be considered for induction. The Hall of Fame has specifically stated any nomination submitted by Ken Duke will not be considered. Professional bass fishing will never be the same, says BASS, as they announced Elite Series anglers will no longer be required to pay to play in 2025. That's right, no more entry fees at the top level of professional bass fishing. Initially, anglers were ecstatic to hear the news, but upon closer examination of the payout structure, the change is not as attractive as anglers had initially hoped because of a little used analytical tool amongst the field called math. One of the Trump administration's main goals of his first 100 days in office is to curb the spread of misinformation on social media. The administration's research has shown one of the most misinformed demographics on social media is that of people who are interested in bass fishing. When asked on how he plans to combat the rapid spread of misinformation amongst the fishing community, Trump stated anyone who wishes to become a fishing influencer must pass a quiz on the correct usage of braided line, vow not to start making Temu ads, and support proof of having held a fishing license for at least 2 years. The Trump administration has estimated the percentage of current fishing influencers set to be flagged for misinformation could be over 75%. Kamala Harris, who bankrupted her $1 billion campaign by $20 million, will never have the opportunity to fix the nation's economy. However, BASS, who is struggling to find common ground with its anglers amid the recent release of its updated payout structure, has offered Harris a treasurer position. The position will lead the charge in cutting back unnecessary spending in order to maximize angler payouts. That'll do it for this week's headlines on bad news. Let us know what you guys think of the segment and how we're doing. Appreciate everyone once again for tuning in to Bass After Dark. We will be back next week with another awesome episode and back in 2 weeks for bad news. Have a good night.
Good job by Justin Kingsley on that. We'll have some notes for him after the show in the After Bass After Dark segment of the show.
Yes.
Oh, let's see. Well, now I think it's basically my turn to get canceled.
Is already?
Well, it's up to you, man. You're in charge.
Was there something else we needed to hit before we went to your cancellation?
Oh, yeah. We got to do a trivia question.
Ah.
But I thought we were going to do that right after
Your cancellation.
top 10, right after I'm canceled.
All right, let's do that.
All right.
And now it's time to cancel Ken.
Tonight's top 10. Top 10 signs you are aware. Number 10. Number 10. You are always cold. Number 9. Even when your tournament partner is right, he's wrong. Number 8. You take an hour to choose between black and blue or June bug. Number 7. You insist on stopping and asking for directions to GPS waypoints. Number 6. When your fishing partner irritates you, you give him the silent treatment. Number 5. You decorate your boat with throw pillows. Number 4. You ask your tournament partner if he's really going to wear that shirt to weigh in. Number 3. You describe your emotional status as fine when you are in fact not fine. Number 2, you ask your partner if your tournament jersey makes you look fat. And the number 1 sign you are a woman angler, you insist your partner shave his fuzzy dice.
Stop.
That's the first time I've ever done the top 10.
Ken, you did good under hostile conditions.
They're fine. They're fine. Thank you, JMO. JMO did a nice job on that.
Yeah.
I like to see them pop up and then read them.
Yeah.
I think that's the pacing we're looking for. But oh well. Well, now we got a trivia
Hey,
question.
it's live TV. It's not easy.
Exactly. We're live, folks. You can't screw up this bad on recording, and that's what we call not rusty craw. D-bomb.
Whatever.
Okay, so we got a great prize. The prize package from Lures and Lead is 3 Spro Rock Crawler 55 crankbaits in popular craw patterns. And you can even see a lot of that black segmentation that Dr. Loughman was talking about. Also, a couple of packs of Berkeley Powerbait Pit Bosses. And tonight's trivia question, we got to be watching that YouTube chat and see who's got the correct answer.
Yes, YouTube and Facebook. Jacob.
It's a race here. Whoever gets the correct answer,
both.
A number. How many anglers fished Ray Scott's first bass tournament, the All-American, on Beaver Lake, Arkansas, in June of 1967? How many anglers in the field?
Hold on 1 second. God.
I don't know what you're doing. I don't know. Okay, how many anglers fished Ray Scott's first bass tournament, the All-American on Beaver Lake, June 1967? Won by Stan Sloan throwing a bomber spin stick. Bill Dance caught the first bass ever in BASS competition, a couple pounds on a flip tail worm. But how many anglers were in that field? Surely someone has gotten it by now. BTC, you got the answer, right?
What?
You got the answer.
Yeah.
Okay. It hadn't popped up yet?
Nope.
I'll tell you what. If this question were asked on Bass University,
close,
it would have been nailed instantly. Oh, I just got a text from JMO. I don't know what that's about, but let's find out.
Come on, where are they at?
He just said nobody's gotten it. Come on, people. I'll give you a weird hint. Which is
go ahead.
Probably just as obscure, but
Bobby Colson.
Bobby Colson. Way to go, Bobby! How many times did Bobby try before he got it?
I don't know. Is that another trivia question?
Yes. No. Ironically, 106 is also the same number of anglers who started the very first Elite Series season back in 2006.
How many finished?
Less than that. I don't know. I have to look that up.
Sorry, Kai.
No worries. No worries. My work here is done. I had a late night tonight, just a very light evening. I asked a couple of questions. I introduced you. I
did a
bungled,
killer.
I bungled the monologue.
Did you?
Yeah, I didn't. I got I was 10 years off on the date of and how many years Nick Cream had been dead. Otherwise, it was okay.
So, Bobby, you won.
Yes, Bobby won 3 rock crawlers, a couple packs of pit bosses. Bobby's one of our favorites, long-time Bass After Dark listener. That's called Not Rusty Craw 2.
That's a pit boss. So here's another story for you, Ken, since we're doing story hour. A few years ago, I went up to the Susquehanna with Mike and our old intern, Eric.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like December-ish or something. It was cold. And we're fishing and water was cold. And I remember asking the guide, I said, I remember the water was in the 30s, somewhere in the mid 30s. And I asked the guide, what are they eating right now? Because, we get up there and Mike had been there a couple of weeks before and he's had, brown jig or little brown purple finesse jig, whatever, all that kind of stuff. And I asked the guys, what are they eating right now? They eat crawls. He's like, nah, crawls are all burrowed in. I said, and we already caught a couple smallies and they were so washed out. You're talking 30 something, mid 30 degrees. So we're just white. I said, all right. And that's a pit boss. That's the 5-inch. But I broke out the 3-inch, the little one, the little pit boss junior in that color and eating on all of them on the back of the boat.
Oh, that's hard to do with Mike Iaconelli in the boat. Are you kidding me? I've had that experience.
A beating.
I know what that's like. That's not.
Rods were broken in protest to this beating. Not my rods. It was a beating. I get lucky every once in a while. But he said, crawls are burrowed. Drink little minnows. I said, okay. That's it.
Nicely done, sir. Good job. Good work.
Ken?
Yes, sir.
Good work tonight, sir.
It's so hard to say au revoir. Let's just say hors d'oeuvre.
Hors d'oeuvres. Hope you guys enjoyed the show tonight. Thank you to everybody that tuned in. Thank you to everybody that tunes in on the iTunes. We appreciate you guys. Don't be shy. Give us a like. Leave us a comment if you feel so inclined. We'd appreciate that. We try our hardest to bring you a fantastic show every week. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you to our guests tonight, Gary Klein, Mike McClelland, Dr. Loughman, Zachary Loughman. Man, I got to shave. Disgusting. And thank you to our interns, Jacob and Ken, the almighty Ken Duke. And we'll be back next week with another fantastic episode of Bass After Dark. Thank you to our sponsors real quick, too. The Bass Tank, Livingston Lures, and Lures and Lead. And now it's time for Dark Thoughts.
Did you go outside last night? Nah, one night. Nah, it's extremely bizarre. Nah. Definitely shock and disbelief.
And now, Dark Thoughts by Brian the Carpenter.
This guy's naked.
All right. Let's try this.
Here's my dark thought. How do we start out talking about crankbaiting in the Northeast? And then I was thinking about you and the energy connected us. And then we start talking about Rumsfeld. What? What? That's dark energy, bro. That's dark energy.
All right. That's a voicemail I got from Epic Eric. I think everybody knows who Epic Eric is. And this was, what, a week or two ago. And we've been talking about fishing. Somehow, politics crept into our conversation. And by the end of it, neither one of us wanted to fish with each other. I feel like. And it's like, man, don't let that shit happen. Keep the light, man. Keep the positivity. That shit's all nonsense. It's all bullshit. Don't let them win. Epic Eric's an awesome dude. And see you guys next week.